We are here with our team, Dr. Estrada and our CFO, Eleanor Lorenz from BPS and their team. And today's overview is regarding academic and student support services. I'd like to read the dockets into the record at this time. Dockets 0536 through 0538. Order for the fiscal year 18 operating budget, including annual appropriations for the school department operations, annual appropriation for the school department, and appropriations for other post-employment benefits. And dockets 0539 through 0543. Capital budget appropriations, including loan orders and lease and purchase agreements. I'd like to remind everyone that this is a public hearing. It is both being broadcast live and recorded on Comcast Channel 8 and RCN Channel 82. I'd ask folks in the chamber to silence any of their electronic devices. And at the conclusion of the BPS presentation and questions and answers from the council, we will take public testimony. We have sign-in sheets to my left by the door. We ask that you sign in and state your name and affiliation and residence. We also take written testimony as well. You can email us at ccc.wm@boston.gov. I'd like to now introduce my colleagues in order of their arrival. To my left, Counselor at Large Anissa Asabi George. To my right, Chairman of Education, Counselor Tito Jackson. And to my left, District City Councilor Matt O'Malley, District City Councilor Tim McCarthy, and District City Councilor Josh Sakem. I'd like to welcome you. And now let me hand it over to you, Doctor.
Is it working?
Yeah.
Okay. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the City Council. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be able to come and share with you the work that's occurring in academics and student support services, in particular academic performance and social emotional learning and wellness. My name is Carla Estrada. I'm the Deputy Superintendent of Academics and Student Support Services for Equity Team, also known as ASSET. And it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Donnie Tran, who is the Assistant Superintendent of Academics and Professional Learning. I also have Nicole Wagner-Lamb, who's the Executive Director of Office of Data and Accountability. I also have Amalia Nieves, who's the Assistant Superintendent of Social Emotional Learning and Wellness. I have, of course, as you've introduced, Eleanor Lawrence, who's our Chief Financial Officer. We also have Jill Carter, who's in the back. Jill Carter, who's our Executive Director of Social Emotional Learning and Wellness. Brian Marks, who is our Director of Opportunity Youth. We also have Avery Esdale, who is our Senior Director of Athletics. And we also have Mary Dillman, who is our Deputy Executive Director of Office and Data and Accountability. Thank you so much, and I will be handing this over to Dr. Tran.
Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. We're honored to be able to speak to you today about academics and professional learning and our current results as a system, and how we cohesively, as a department around data and accountability and academics, work to ensure that every student has tasks that are worth doing and that every teacher is empowered to treat every student like they're the smartest kid in the class. In simple language, that's how I think of a lot of our work. I want to give a quick thanks to my team who are in the gallery over there, who oversee all of our academic program. And I'll quickly now turn it over to Nicole Wagner-Lamb to discuss our current results and outcomes as a system.
Great, good morning. Thanks very much for having us. So the first slide that we're going to walk through today is some data regarding BPS's performance in grades 3 to 8 English Language Arts, as well as grades 3 to 8 Mathematics, grades 10 English Language Arts, and grade 10 Mathematics. And so in the upper left-hand corner, you see grade 3 to 8 English Language Arts. And this is actually a graph of the Composite Performance Index. It is a measure of the proficiency of students in grades 3 to 8 in BPS over time, so for the past 4 years. You'll see that there is a blue line that's somewhat in the middle, and this is the average CPI for students, for all students in BPS in those grade levels. We've also broken the data out for a few of our major racial ethnic categories. We have Asian students here in orange. We have another blue line, which is white students. We have a yellow line for Hispanic and a gray line for Black students. And each one of these graphs is the same in terms of the fact that it's broken out by those racial subcategories. And what you'll see is that in English language arts, we do see some modest improvements in average CPI over time. The average CPI for all students is 74.1 in the past year, which essentially is equivalent to students being in sort of the high needs improvement category. It means that they're approaching proficiency, but not necessarily proficient. And so one of the reasons why we're not using proficiency as a measure here, especially for grades 3 to 8, is that many of you may know we have had some major shifts in our assessments, state assessments. And so we've used MCAS for many years that had a proficiency measure that stayed consistent over time. And then over the past couple of years, we've used the PARC assessment, which has a little bit of a different way of looking at proficiency. And so the state has gone ahead and created an equivalent measure over time, which is this composite performance index. And that's how we're able to compare between the years when we took MCAS and the years when we took PARC. Again, we've seen some modest improvements in English language arts in grades 3 to 8, as well as in English and mathematics in grades 3 to 8, as well as grade 10 ELA and math. However, what you will see is that we do have some substantial performance gaps when you break the data out by race and ethnicity. So for in ELA in grades 3 to 8, you'll see that the gap is approximately a little under 20 CPI points, which is essentially a gap of almost a whole performance level on average. And so I'm really just kind of averaging the performance of our white and Asian students and then looking at Hispanic or Latino and African American and Black students to come up with that performance gap. So that's essentially what we're seeing here in ELA and math in grades 3 to 8 and grade 10. And I'm going to turn it over to Donnie Tran to talk a little bit about some of the things we're doing.
So when we look at the performance over time in ELA, we believe that the upticks that Ms. Land discussed are the results of at least two very important factors. First of all, they are likely to be resulting from the heavy investment that we have made in early childhood, that we're now seeing students come into these tested grades with additional skills, with additional competencies. Secondly, over this time frame, invested heavily in really, really rich, rigorous curriculum for grades 3 through 5 in ELA. And so we believe that those richer texts, better tasks, better instruction, and more preparation have yielded some of the results that we see here. Over this past year, we also invested in math curriculum from K to 8. We believe that the new curriculum that we've put in place pushes students to do more of the sorts of thinking that they are expected to do on these assessments, and more of the thinking that we think is preparatory for college and career. So we are excited about seeing the continued results of those investments, among others. I mean, those are only 3 large work streams. However, they don't capture the total amount of work that all of our departments do every day.
Thank you. And then moving to the next slide, we have given some similar data, again, grades 3 to 8 ELA and math, as well as grade 10 ELA and math. But here the data is also broken out for English learners and former English learners, which is in the gray line, and then students with disabilities in the orange line. And so you can see that the performance of these two subgroups in the 2 different subjects that we're looking at here, as well as the different grade levels, those 2 different subgroups have performance that is below those of all other students, but we actually see some more significant gains for English language learners and former English language learners, as well as students with disabilities over time than when we break the data out specifically by race and ethnicity. So I think it helps us to think a little bit more about what Dr. Tran has to offer in terms of what we're really doing on a programmatic level, and how we can target students with certain learning needs and really accelerate their progress.
So I want to speak to three important investments that we are taking on both this year and into the next school year. First, and this is, I'm also very proud to say that these are all representative of collaboration between the academics department, the data and accountability department, social emotional learning and wellness, special education, English language learners, opportunity achievement gap. As you can see, it's a whole crew of people all collaborating to do this work, which is actually how we think it should be done. We're making investments in early literacy to ensure that every child leaves second grade with the foundational literacy skills to be successful in the rest of their academic career. In addition to also making sure that they have behavioral supports, which I'll let Amalio speak to a little bit more later. And also ensuring that every classroom, regardless of program type, has access to the same curriculum. This is a core equity issue that we are taking on as well. And we also need to invest in the sorts of trainings and support that allow teachers to make that curriculum and those tasks accessible to all users, to all learners. Those three big buckets of investments and those allocations of resources are all aligned to the next slide, where we talk about the instructional competencies that we want to guide our work moving forward. We wanted to name exactly what we mean by equitable, high-quality instruction. I began my teaching career in Boston Public Schools with Dr. Payzant, and we had these posters in every classroom that articulated the sort of non-negotiables of good instruction. And we wanted to bring that into the modern era, recognizing that our city is more diverse than it ever has been before, and our students have additional needs that we need to take into account. And these instructional competencies fall into four large buckets that we want to see in every classroom. First, we want instructors to be able to create safe, healthy, and sustaining learning environments for all students. We want them to be able to develop learning experience that demonstrate design for access for all students. We want them to be able to engage all students in cognitively demanding tasks and instruction that challenges them and advances their learning. And we want to employ strategies for assessment for learning as opposed to of learning that allow students to authentically develop and demonstrate their knowledge and skills. And over the course of this presentation, I think you can see all of the different departments that make up the asset department more broadly, which I listed out earlier and I won't do again. They're all represented here because we think that this is what it takes to really educate all students in the city. But for the purposes of this discussion, we are focusing primarily around this question of cognitively demanding tasks and instruction and assessment for learning. Are the resources that students are engaged with worth their time? And are teachers taking what they're seeing their students do and adjusting their practice accordingly? And so with that, I'll turn it over for some more comments on assessment for learning.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Tran. Well, what I wanted to add was that our two departments work very closely, especially when it comes to how the investments around curriculum as well as assessments for learning are actually built into how schools work. For example, we have a set of data coaches who actually go out to schools. We have them in 30 schools right now, intensively coaching school administrators, instructional leadership teams, teacher teams, on how to bring together many different data points, more than what I presented here today, triangulating those different data points to get a much more nuanced picture of what it is that students are struggling with. What is the learner-centered problem that we really need to address through instruction? And they work with these schools to take an inquiry approach, a cycle of inquiry by which they identify a learner-centered problem, they identify practices that they together as teacher teams will actually execute on. They collect data on the extent to which those are being implemented with fidelity and how students are doing. in an effort to know if the changes in practices that they're making are truly bearing fruit. So to Dr. Tran's point, when we think about how the extent to which we want curriculum to be rigorous, the extent to which we use much more nuanced assessments, cognitively demanding tasks, as well as assessments that are truly aligned to our curriculum, we're really making a move away from teaching to test, but actually using these as instructional tools.
Just as Ms. Lamb talked about the data inquiry team as being exemplary as an example of how we want to think about the integration of those 4 competencies, I also want to highlight another bright spot in the form of our pre-K to 2 work. As you can see here, we're trying to create an integrated, holistic system that meets the needs of all students by really investing in teacher capacity, really investing in curriculum, and aligning that curriculum across those 3 grades to make sure that it provides a consistent, coherent experience for students that are moving through it under the guidance of highly qualified, highly trained, very thoughtful practitioners that we continually both provide professional development to, but also coaching to. So you can see here the umbrella continue to be those 4 competencies, but we enact those 4 competencies through things like classroom structures, through materials, through training, and the integration of multiple content areas into thematic units. As the father of a K-1 student in the BPS system, I can tell you he comes home talking about all of these, all the things that he's learning, and he's incredibly excited to go to school every day as a result of this integrated thematic approach that's differentiated for all students. So I think we'll pivot now to just sharing some of the details or the highlights of our budget. My department is sort of made up of 3 major buckets. The team, my sort of leadership team, sits under this academics RC. The work of Dr. Sachs and his early childhood team, the early learning services department, is another RC. The instructional research and development department, which encompasses all of the content areas, sits under that next bucket. We are excited that we are making some important investments in this area. We've reallocated some FTEs in order to just make them more aligned. They used to be spread out a little bit across multiple departments. We're now bringing those sort of more in-house. And we're excited about several grants that our teams have received in order to continue this work of advancing educational equity and improvement. And I'll let Ms. Lamb talk about the data and accountability budget.
So to what we shared before, we have an office of data and accountability that has been around for many years doing, it used to be called research, evaluation, and assessment, for those of you who've known of it before. And we actually have 2 really big streams of work. One is the data inquiry work that I already referenced, where right now we currently have 7 FTE, and next year we are going to be growing to a team of 9 who will be out in schools coaching, who will be managing formative assessments for the district, and being really present at more schools. And then the second piece of our office's work is really managing research, accountability, and performance management work. And so these are, the performance management work is the newest piece to what we do. We as a office are collaborating with departments all throughout BPS to identify goals and targets, and to actually convene data inquiry at the executive level, at the central office level, where we are, as a system, taking a look at our data and trying to identify places where we see that there may be some systemic barriers to closing the opportunity and achievement gap. And so those 2 big work streams are what comprise the office.
And with that, we thank you first, and welcome questions that you might have.
Thank you, and let me acknowledge that we've been joined by District City Councilor Andrea Campbell. Let me now recognize Councilor Anise Sabi-George.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I have a few questions about, just from your presentation, on the performance over time. will we ever measure sort of the effectiveness of Excellence for All or the advanced work classroom students over time? So even if they're no longer sort of in a quote-unquote EFA or AWC room, will we measure that over time?
Yes, so Dr. Tran may be able to speak to it a little bit as well as Dr. Estrada, but there is a plan to start to evaluate the Excellence for All program. And so that will likely be making some comparisons to the work that's been done for a long time around AWC. At this point, we don't have any data to be able to kind of complete that evaluation, but there is that is in the work.
Do we have any anecdotal data or any sort of best practices from EFA in particular? Because that's what we seem to be most excited about as a district.
That's right. I think one of the things that we are most excited about is the introduction of a capstone assessment for EFA. We're hoping to do at least one and hopefully two, potentially three of these integrated capstone assessments that are performance tasks. They are more authentic, richer than, and more connected to what we would want to see a college and career-ready BPS student do. And so as we deploy those in the EFA setting and also broaden it outside of that context, because we want to see that be the sort of foundational assessment for many grades and contents, I think we'll see a lot of important data there when we look at the results of those portfolio or these performance assessments.
So are we looking to add additional testing to the classroom? Because I think that the general agreement is across broad sort of sectors in education is to get away from testing, and there's a desire to get away from, working towards the test.
Yep.
But now we're looking to add an additional assessment.
This would be
Go ahead.
this would be assessment. The research is very clear that assessment for learning, that in real time formative assessment is an incredible boost to learning and engagement that feels, as long as it feels authentic. So I don't know if we are necessarily moving away from testing. We're just moving away from certain types of testing that feel less authentic and less connected to learning. These performance assessments will be very engaging, more project-based, more problem-based and will feel like a rich and exciting project to students.
Okay, and then tied to the expeditionary learning that we're using in EFA classrooms?
That's correct.
Why do we use that curriculum as opposed to the AWC curriculum in the EFA classrooms?
So in looking at side by side, the expeditionary learning curriculum has richer texts, by and large, more diverse texts that are culturally reflective of more of the students across the district. The tasks that are associated with them are also incredibly rich and engaging, and so the choice of expeditionary learning in many of those classrooms is reflective of that sort of side-by-side comparison.
And I've heard from several teachers who teach using the EL curriculum that they don't have real access to the curriculum, or some of the curriculum is taken down offline before they get to use it in their classroom. Is that an issue that we're facing district-wide?
Not to my knowledge. All of the curricular units are available online all the time from multiple sources, either from the Expeditionary Learning website or from our own academics department. But I will look into any gaps in that access.
Okay. I can share with you some of the sort of critical, I think productive concerns that some of the teachers and parents that I've discussed Excellence for All with have had, especially in comparison to their relationship to AWC and the work that they've seen come out of AWC. I think it would be really important to see as we move district-wide to Excellence for All, and my hope is at least maintain, if not grow, AWC access, that we look at those results as well for those students over time. I think that there's, a little, with some of your presentation today, talking about the assessment concerns me a little bit, that we're adding assessments and adding testing for our kids over time. I just want to make sure that we're working our way away from standardized testing. I do have a little bit of a concern, though, when we rely on the results of MCAS, for example, for grading our schools, how do we totally walk away from it?
So
And
can
it's
I,
sort of this conflict that we find
Yeah.
ourselves in as a district.
I just wanted to clarify because I think in your other question, I think it was brought up, and I want to make sure it's clear that one of the things that we're exploring with EFA, that's the purpose of EFA, is for us to also learn and be able to see what are some ways in which we could actually build stronger assessment tools that are not test-based, and things like projects that students would be able to demonstrate not only leadership skills, but also their cognitive abilities and understanding how to read, how to speak, how to write, how to listen in a variety of different disciplines. So what we're trying to do is move away from just using MCAS as our only data dipstick. And so we've developed a couple of tools as well for schools to begin to assess the actual tasks that the kids are engaged in. Is it rigorous, or does it just fall back on basic recall skills, which are important, but shouldn't be the only center of our instruction? Our students should be able to think critically, be able to communicate, be able to be creative. And so how do our tasks do those kinds of things, not just a standardized test? So that is part of what
I'd
we're
say
trying
that's
to
what
move.
we want as
Yes,
educators, but
that's right.
unfortunately, our schools are graded.
And we're listening.
And our teachers are so often graded on how their kids are performing on these standardized tests.
Agreed. Yeah.
I'll save the, I have
Okay.
additional questions, of course, I'll save them for the next round.
Thank you.
Thank you. Counselor Jackson.
Thank you so much. I guess first I wanted to understand your budget. So your budget is actually going down from $17,851,501 to $16,851,739. I do realize, one, I want to understand what the MOVA dollars were actually paying for. And also, how is BPS continuing what has gone on with those dollars?
You mentioned for MOVA, so for social emotional learning and wellness, Amalia will go into some of the work that they've been doing to transition that. But to answer the question, as far as the MOVA dollars, a big key aspect of the MOVA dollars was to be focused also on capacity building, especially around trauma. And so there's been a lot of toolkits as well as professional learning that's been provided to schools to build capacity in being trauma-informed schools. We also have, we use the MOVA dollars to also help us begin to look at how do we assess as a district need. Particular, if you think about each student has certain needs and then they go to different schools. So where might certain schools be more highly impacted with students with a higher level of need and which ones have not? And so the MOVA grant created an opportunity for us to create what we're calling the Opportunity Index. And we've been able to start testing that and figure out, is it a good way for us to be able to, whether it's guide our decisions around fiscal decisions, but also potentially, deciding who should get additional resources, things like that. So the MOVA grant has really served for us a variety of outputs that are impacting us long term. I think the question around supports and services for the schools is something that Amalia has been working with each individual school and the MOVA grant folks to see how do we work, especially during the summer, to continue to build the community of partners. What we found from the grant, I just had a debrief on this yesterday, was that there's a lot of support networks outside of the school, but we're not always necessarily directly connected to them or bringing them into the school and building those strong relationships. And so that's one of the things in this year grant that we're trying to explore to sustain those kinds of student support services.
Can you go over any EI cuts that actually occurred in this year versus last year? In terms of supports, I know that there were several individuals who contacted me at the end of last year around changes, social workers and supports. Can you help us understand any of the changes that occurred from last year to this year?
Just so I'm clear on the questions around emotional impairment, if there were any cuts to that program.
Yes, ma'am.
So this year there have been no cuts to this program, but what we have seen is based on students' individual IEP needs, things based on different students that may have increased for certain kids just because of their individualized IEP needs.
But last year there were financial cuts to that line item.
For the weighted student funding, yes. I thought
Yeah.
you meant for coming this.
Yeah,
18,
no,
then.
but
Oh, okay,
I want
17, 18 is
to I want
good.
to understand, because if we don't go back to where we are versus where we were last year, then I want to understand, has there been a restoration one of the things that we heard from the sanctuary schools conversation and hearing that we did is that there's huge amounts of trauma that's going on in schools based on young people who are documented and undocumented who feel unsafe in schools. And we need to understand trauma from an epidemiological perspective, and that you can kind of catch it.
Sure.
And so that is knowing that we had a cut there and understanding that the need has actually increased rather than decreased based on things that are happening nationally. I want to get that understanding. We had an actual financial cut. What did that translate into from the year before to this year financially? And service delivery wise, how did you accommodate for the dollars that actually don't exist in this budget?
So for emotional impairment, so the programs themselves, as far as FTEs, did shift from last year to this year, and I'm sure Eleanor can share like the actual dollars, what that difference would be. But we also, as far as supports and services go, the supports and services still follow each individual student. And so those supports and services do not change based on IEP need. As far as you talked about our immigrant youth, so that separate population of students who may be experiencing those kinds of needs, we have a network of folks who have developed resources and begun to also build training on understanding, in particular this has come from Amalio's shop and the Office of English Language Learners, on the impact of learning and stress. And so beginning to build people's understanding of what those needs may be has been our first step. I think the next step, in particular for our immigrant youth, and I think this is a opportunity that we welcome as well, is to start to figure out who are the support services out there that have that expertise in working with immigrant youth that may be different. So that is a place that I think we continue to be reflective of how we can grow that part.
Yeah. So can we get the actual financial, because this is the one, not one, one of the issues I have with BPS is you're telling me you have less money, less people, but the young people are going to get the same service. I can't buy that when you have an increase in need. You have less people, less dollars to actually do that. You can be as efficient as humanly possible, but one person can only be in one place at one time. And so that worries me when I hear year over year there's less funding and also less people to do more work. Right. So I again, and I realize, how this works is the mayor gives you your budget and you got to make it work. I get that. This again shows for the most vulnerable population of young people that we're talking about, we don't have enough resources there to provide them at least what we did last year. And we're going to go into a year where this is actually not being restored. So I just want to go on record there. So can we have an understanding from 16 to 17, what financial as well as FTE changes happened in that space?
We made adjustments to our weighted student funding formula last year that saved $5 million in the area, in these areas that we're discussing. That was based on changing staffing guidelines in select areas of our special education classrooms. The class size guidelines changed. Typically, I think it was the addition of one student in a classroom that would typically have 2 to 4 adults present.
Okay, so I'm going to go on record. Your definition of savings, I consider a cut, and it's a cut in resources, it's a cut in services, and it's a cut in support for the most vulnerable young people. BPS, has been lauded for being one of the only large school districts to actually close the achievement gap and work towards that over the course of a year. We shoot ourselves in the foot every single time that we excel at something and then pull back and don't put forward the resources to actually continue this. This, by the way, is when we look at these graphs, that's the achievement gap. When we look at ELA and we look at the math scores and you see this, that's the achievement gap. And if you have been going, you've been doing a good job at actually closing. And I give you props for that. But when you take away resources, I'm just gonna guess what's going to end up happening is you're either not going to close it as fast, or in all honesty, you're actually going to move in the opposite direction. And so I again, for this population of young people who we know and we know young people are largely poor, and oftentimes not only see trauma in schools, but also see trauma in and around their neighborhoods. And sadly, many of you experienced it on what happened inside the actual bowling building a little bit earlier this year. That was traumatic for all of us as adults. Imagine what happens to young people in their neighborhoods when there's no one to process that for them. Because remember, those supports are technically attached to schools. Most of the times in the neighborhoods and communities that doesn't exist. We have to do better here, and we have to put forward the resources. And that $5 million year over year, and I'm also seeing that it's obviously not restored. So therefore, that is actually a net cut over the course of 2 years. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
I'd just like to remind my colleagues that we haven't heard the social emotional learning and wellness presentation yet. We're on the academics portion of this. If we can kind of stick to that subject matter at this point. I'd like to recognize that we've been joined by Counselor at Large Michelle Wu, as well as Counselor at Large Ayanna Presley, and Chair recognizes Counselor Matt O'Malley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be brief just on the first aspect of this hearing. If we look at I don't know what the slide numbers, but page 2 and 3, which show the charts. I have them here, you have them there, but maybe for the folks in the audience. Things seem pretty steady, which is good. So congratulations to that. It does seem like there's a slight dip on, I believe it's English, ELL, English language learners have dipped down a bit in grades 3 to 8, English language arts, and I believe it's English language learners as well on grade 10 math MCAS. Any trends or anything that may account for that, where everything else seems pretty steady?
You're right there. So for the English language arts piece in grades 3 to 8 for ELLs, there really hasn't been an actual dip, but it's just basically stayed stagnant. And then for grade 10 math, we did see a little bit of a dip. I think that, it's also important to remember that there has been progress over time. And so, for these populations that are seeing sort of accelerated progress, there's sort of always there's always a chance that we may see something kind of dip down. I don't personally have an answer to exactly why, but
which described as learners formerly, we find that we also need to continue to monitor and provide those supports. And so one of the things that we've been very focused on this school year is building the capacity of folks to know who those students are, because that's the other piece, but also knowing what are some ongoing strategies that we need to also target for that population of students as they continue to grow in their proficiency. It's just like literacy, reading and writing, you're always continuing to grow, and the same thing with English language development. I would say the other thing is that we've been aware that some of our students are long-term English learners, which means that they've been an English learner for more than 5 years. So they've been in our school systems for longer than 5 years and have not reclassified, which usually it takes about 5 to 6 years, and we're not seeing that. So another group of students within that data is targeting those that have been long-term English learners, and how do we begin to build very targeted interventions for those kids has been another part of our focus this year, and we'll continue on to next year. A big focus for us is interventions and acceleration. Those kids who have those kind of gaps, we're finding that it's not enough to just do an intervention. We need to do a very targeted acceleration, because as the rigor keeps growing in the system, the achievement gap will continue to grow, because the other kids continue to grow in their own performance. And if we don't close that gap sooner, that's when we start to see a decline over time as well.
Well, no, I appreciate that, and obviously agree with you. It's, and I'm particularly focused on sort of ELLs and the challenges. Yeah. How many of our ELL students have an IEP?
Currently, we have, and I will double check my numbers, but I believe we have about 4,000 of our ELLs are students with disabilities.
And what's that percentage out of how many?
Of the 30% of our ELs, that would be probably about 10%, 11% of our students.
Wait, I'm sorry. I think I'm asking the question wrong. What percentage of our ELL students have some challenges or an IEP or some, is it larger than sort of the general population, smaller, the same?
I mean, smaller, so of those, about 11,000 students who are English learners, a smaller proportion, so probably about 10% of our students are ELs that are students with disabilities.
And it's closer to 20% for sort of the
For special education, that's right. So they're a
Interesting.
subgroup of that 20% and a subgroup of that EL
Understood.
percent.
Interesting.
It would
And-
look different on the percentage.
Sure. And then you talk about sort of interventions. Is there a backlog at all of students that need intervention support?
It's not necessarily backlog. Our schools are doing a really nice job of identifying which are the students. I think Nicole did a really nice job highlighting the data inquiry work that they're doing. I think it's also, like I said, ensuring that those interventions are implemented with fidelity is one aspect that we're looking at. So the quality of that implementation. And then the second thing would be those students who need, 2-3 year gap closing of whether it's in literacy or math skills. That's where we're being very reflective right now and saying, what do we need to do to accelerate those students? That's where I'm seeing a real focus for us for next year, is to say those students who are getting intervention, but the closing of that gap in performance is not fast enough. What could we be doing to better increase the acceleration of that?
And please.
Many schools have, like Dr. Estrada said, many schools have figured out incredible systems for supporting students in a differentiated, personalized way. What we are hoping to do as we move forward is network those schools together so that schools that have similar populations, similar student issues, can learn from one another, and also to build some coherence with what exact interventions they're using. We see a lot of schools sort of figuring it out on an island, and there's no real reason that they have to do that, and we can do that centrally as a support.
Okay. And I'm not sure if this comes under your sort of overview or maybe a subsequent hearing, but is there still a wait list for students waiting to get their IEP?
At this point, there are certain situations that sometimes delay, but more than not, I would say that most students are in their timelines required for getting their IEPs completed. However, sometimes there might be situations.
Things can arise on the last day of school that, things
things like that, or gathering assessment data, things like that. But we've worked really hard to ensure that we don't have overdue IEPs.
Okay. That's terrific because that has been an issue in the past. So I'm
And I
glad to
welcome,
hear that.
and I'll make sure to flag that for when the special ed team comes.
Yeah,
so that way they
I'd
can
just
have
like to get some
trend data.
concrete numbers on that, but
We'll
I
make sure
appreciate
to do
take you
that.
at your word and appreciate that. Thank you all. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
I just wanted to, I'm not sure if you wanted me to follow up to confirm the
Clarify.
numbers around the proportion of English learners that are students with disabilities, but I believe you said about approximately 10%.
Yes.
And that's right. And so that is lower than the district average. Yeah.
Yes.
So, and we know that from other analysis that we've done that English learners, while there's sort of a perception that they're more likely to be identified as students with disabilities,
Not in BPS.
in some longitudinal work that we've been doing, we've seen sort of the opposite.
Thank you, Nicole.
I'd like to now acknowledge that we've been joined by City Councilor at Large, Michael Flaherty, Councilor McCarthy.
As well, as these things seem to have been going a bit long. I appreciate the three investments that you had talked about, Doctor, regarding early literacy. Obviously, you build on a foundation. If they have that foundation, you can go as high as you want to go. The same curriculum is very important, as well as the support and the tracking. This goes hand in hand, I believe, with the investment in technology. Where are we with that? Because in District 5, I'm hearing that we have too much testing. We all agree on that. But during the middle of tests, computers are falling, stopping, freezing. They have to reset them, losing Wi-Fi in the middle of tests, and kids are getting incredibly frustrated. Teachers are getting frustrated with smartboard breakdowns, things like that. Where are we with the investment in technology?
So I will let some of my other colleagues speak to this as well, but so right now we're in the middle of MCAS testing for grades 3 to 8, and
Oh,
we
yeah.
are moving to online testing by 2019 for all of our students in those grades as well as grade 10. And I have to say that my team, we go out to all schools where there's online testing to visit them, to make sure that they are prepared, to support them in the actual experience of online testing. And while I'm sure that there are definitely moments where teachers, students, and schools feel frustrated with these blips, I can say with complete authenticity that the schools that I've gone to this year, it has been the rate of success is exponential in comparison to 2 years ago. The extent to which our schools are fully fitted with accessible Wi-Fi and in pretty much every classroom that the Wi-Fi is sufficient to sustain the load of students testing on it, I've almost run into no problems. And so teachers who are getting familiar with this experience, I mean, it's a little scary at first for teachers. Sometimes we find less so for students, honestly, but they're learning that, yes, if there's a momentary blip, the assessment platform is completely prepared for that. And so there are some things you can do to get students back on. I've run into almost no situations this year where students have actually lost any of the answers that they had entered. I know that's not fully what you're asking about. You're asking more about technology infrastructure in
Sure,
general.
but
But I did want to share that those are our experiences this year, and it's really been a huge improvement over the last couple
No,
of
I
years.
appreciate that. I just want to make sure that in 2019, we're prepared.
Yeah, that's right.
Because I think there's a lot of teachers that are very nervous about not being prepared, and they should be. I know that technology, as it continues to advance, a lot of high schools, especially in the private sector, they've gone to tablets. They don't have books at all, which is a problem in BPS right now because we don't seem to have books at all either, to be honest with you. A lot of classrooms do not have books, and the books that they do have are clearly dated. Is there a movement to go that way? And I'll tell you why. Because some of the high schools that have gone to tablets are quickly going away from tablets. Because when you have this in front of you, it doesn't matter if I'm listening to you. I can be checking my fantasy football team. I can be chatting with my girlfriend across the hall. I can do whatever I want. And a lot of teachers in the higher level, private school and public, are finding that kids can swipe off a screen faster than you can get from your desk to their desk. So where are we with that? Are we heading that way? Are we going to stick with some books and maybe buy some?
So we are a proud recipient recently of a grant from the Verizon Foundation to provide one-to-one access for a number of technology tools at a very robust number of schools. I can't exactly remember the precise number. However, I think what much of what you're asking about comes down to the skill of the teacher, right? And how they create a classroom culture that encourages productive and responsible use of technology, and also making sure that our students are equipped with good judgment around when to use technology for what reason, because that's what college and career preparation is really about, is making sure that they can tell that difference, while at the same time using it appropriately in the classroom when it does advance learning. And that is a large part of the professional learning that we are doing relative to that grant, and that we'll learn a lot from as we consider what our technology strategy across the district with regards to one-to-one might be.
Okay.
Yes, there's a significant evaluation project that will be associated with that Verizon grant. We do have, I'll have to pass this question along to our Chief Information Officer, Mark Racine, about how many of our schools were previously one-to-one before this Verizon grant, but there are a number who have been one-to-one for a while, and then this Verizon grant I know will be focused on middle schools. And so to Dr. Tran's point, really making sure that the instruction that's happening on technology is engaging enough that we're not really struggling with the fact that students are seeing it as a tool to sort of escape from something that may not feel that engaging.
Okay. Can you just walk me through the process of when schools are assessed to go to their next level? Is that, does BPS completely do that? Is that collaboratively with the state? Who's on that team? And the reason I say is because yesterday I was asking questions about the Channing School, which is a school that I'm very concerned about. They're starting to do very, very well, but losing the name of not being a great school, losing that people just don't think it's a great school. And it is. And I've been in there a bunch of times. They have a principal there who's very active, and she's wonderful, and the kids are engaging. But we're concerned about it. It's level 4. It's been a turnaround school now for 3 years. And I feel like they're not getting the support that they need. So as they're assessed this year, how does that work? Can you just walk me through that?
So you're speaking of the assessment, the accountability levels.
Correct.
So essentially there is an accountability system that we've been under for a number of years, which is changing as we move into ESSA. But these accountability levels are assigned by the state. And so for schools that are, as I'm sure you guys have heard of, level 1, 2, and 3, those accountability levels are very much based on the 3 or 4 years of past data. It's a formula that the state has come up with, and there are a few caveats to that. Schools that don't have high enough participation rates in testing are not eligible for level 1 and 2. Nevertheless, for schools that are in turnaround status, and I believe we will have a presentation on turnaround, I think this afternoon.
That's correct.
So I think that we should let Liza Vito speak to this more, but they are collecting as much data as they can on their measurable annual goals to be able to, first of all, progress monitor so that they can course correct to make sure that they are improving in the way that you are sharing. And then those data are going to be presented to the state by BPS. And so I'll let Liza speak more to that. So yeah.
Yep. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Campbell.
Thank you, Councilor Siomo. And thank you guys for the presentation this morning. I will start off saying, I'm okay with testing, not sort of over testing, but testing just to sort of get the data that we have here. And I must say, I have to breathe because I look at this data and it's like, it's depressing. It's extremely depressing, particularly for students of color. So I'm just curious sort of how long we think it will take to change this. What are the barriers in sort of specific terms? And then what are the sort of solutions? Like, who do we reach out to in terms of best practices, in terms of, we talked about network schools earlier. So the idea that there's a school out there sort of in limbo or in an island by themselves trying to figure out how to close the achievement gap is ridiculous, especially when we're in a day and age where we have private schools, charter schools, you name it, including some BPS schools getting great results. So how do we work together in terms of best practices, identifying what those are in specific terms, and then making sure that every school has that? So I know that's a lot of questions, but I guess it's one, how long do we think it will take to not continue to see this? What are the barriers? And then what are some sort of best practices, solutions? I don't think it's merely money, and that's why I'm asking these specific questions. So whoever wants to answer, that would be great.
Well, Councilor Campbell, let me just say thank you for the question. It's exactly the right thing that we are all obsessed about all the time. When we created these instructional competencies, which are on slide 4, I believe, we started with research about what gap closing schools do. And then we also cross-referenced it with our own local examples of schools that are truly doing a wonderful job of meeting the needs of all their students and closing gaps on a daily basis. And then went and pressure tested it with teachers and administrators and other central office departments. And we believe that these 4 competencies represent our best bet for what it will take, to your point of what are the skills, what are the best practices. And we're going to use these instructional competencies to align all of our professional learning, all of our resource procurement. Like when we're choosing curriculum, we're going to make sure that it helps to create a bias-free, sustaining learning environment for all students so that they see themselves in what they are learning, which is absolutely critical for student achievement, especially for students of color. And similarly, we know that we need to, by looking at these instructional competencies, when we look at that second one, designing for access, that tells us that we need to teach every single teacher how to look at a diverse classroom of students and make sure that they are thinking about the barriers that each kid has and designing the curriculum, designing the learning experience appropriately. So we are using these 4 instructional competencies as the touchstones for all of our work. And one example in which this is going to play out, the departments that have been just clamoring to work together have been collaborating around 4 courses that are going to align to each of these instructional competencies that will be co-developed and delivered by members of my team, the academics team, Amalia's team, the social emotional learning and wellness team, the Office of Opportunity Achievement Gap, the Special Education Office, the English Language Learners Office. These teams have not worked together before in the way that they need to in order to build teacher skill and to provide the training that those teachers require in order to meet these competencies.
So I will say, I mean, this is very high level. So I get, just like in my office, we have 3 big bucket items that we work from, and everything falls within those buckets. It's rare that we're sort of outside of those buckets. So I see these as the buckets. But if I'm a parent, frankly, I don't care about this, right? I want to know what is my school, what is my district doing to close the achievement gap for my son, for my daughter. And so what I mean, so just because we're sort of, time is of the essence, I do want to answer to the question of how long do we think this will take? 5 years, 10 years, 25 years? It's not going to take a year.
Right.
It's not going to take 2 years. But I think folks do want to know realistically, how long might this take? 2, they want to know in specific terms what the barriers are. So it might be some schools are operating in silos. It might be some teachers aren't creative or entrepreneurial in developing a curriculum or working with others well. It might be some schools need more trauma support for certain types of students. I don't know, what all of the gap closing, research says, but what does it say about what the barriers are? And then what does it offer in terms of best practices? At the end of that report, what are the things that we should be striving to do?
So I want to speak just to make it very concrete, because I agree with you. These are high level things that are going to guide our work, but I want to talk about 3 places where they show up most clearly. First,
can we do the first question first? How long?
How long? So let me let Ms. Lamb talk about that in the context of the performance meter, and then also in terms of the Opportunity Achievement Gap implementation plan.
Yes, so I alluded to this before when I was sharing out the work that the Office of Data and Accountability is doing, but we've taken on a new body of work that we call performance management. And so the first piece of that was actually creating a BPS performance meter, which is essentially a tool that we would use as a district to hold ourselves accountable, the entire district, not looking at how certain schools are doing relative to other schools, literally holding ourselves accountable. And so we have created the measures. And on this BPS performance meter, the first 2 key performance indicators are the achievement and opportunity gap in ELA and the achievement and opportunity gap in math. And I think that one of the key things that we can do and that we need to do is actually quantify what that gap is, so that we're not just kind of looking at averages and hoping that, given the fact that we're seeing some incremental improvements, that we're going to be able to close it. We have set some targets for ourselves that are not so aggressive as to say that we would close this gap in 3 years, but they are aggressive enough that the hope is that we would be substantially closing this gap in the next 5 to 7 years. So we can share that performance meter with you in more detail. It's something that's publicly available, and the body of work that our office is doing is to really hold the system accountable for keeping a laser-like focus on all student subgroups and on these opportunity and achievement gaps.
So, Councilor Kemba, I think it's also important, and at our next academic presentation, Dr. Rose will also be here to go into more detail, but I will try to articulate what the Opportunity Achievement Gap Task Force, as well as our OAG office, has really outlined to ensure that the accountability to meeting certain benchmarks are important. But I think what's more powerful about the way they've examined this, when you look at Opportunity Achievement Gap work, you see that it's not just about the teaching and learning that happens in the classroom, that there is also a variety of other elements, the community, family support, there's a variety of the things. And so what Dr. Rose has done is worked with every single department in BPS and created an opportunity achievement gap or equity-based goal, SMART goal, to say that every single one of us have a responsibility to understanding how we perpetuate biases and issues of inequities within the system, but also that we have a responsibility to continue to embrace all the other partners that exist outside of BPS, because that's the only way we're going to be able to come to the solution as well.
Well, I'll say this, I have no more questions, but I still have 2 questions that sort of haven't gotten answers, which is one, that sort of how long piece, very helpful. You know, to say to a family 5 to 7 years based on existing plans, and also understanding that could change, right? The second is, you know, what are the barriers? And then the third is, what are the best practices, or, you know, the 3 places it's showing up? Answer to those questions would be very helpful, and I can save questions for the next round.
I just,
do.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I said we will do.
Okay. Could we go back to the slide? So I just, for clarity, the slide that we have on grade 10 English Language Arts MCAS has a 110. Is that just an erroneous 110, or is there a skewed scoring measure?
I'm sorry, can you help me to?
So it has 100 here, and then there's 110.
Oh, my. Yeah, the axis on that is just a little bit in error. I apologize for that.
So, okay, so
There weren't
that's
any-
erroneous. You don't go
Yeah.
to a different measuring. Okay.
No, it's
okay.
just literally how the graph was created.
Okay, and then I'm just curious because, again, I think there's a good story here insofar as grades 3 to 8, there's a much wider achievement gap than grade 10. Am I reading that graph right?
So one thing I would say to that, for those of you who have sort of known about Massachusetts testing, and it's true in other states too, is that given the fact that the 10th grade MCAS is the competency determination requirement for graduation in the state of Massachusetts, that assessment, the standards on that assessment are probably not to the level of rigor that we would hope that all students are performing, you know, if they are accessing higher level coursework, for example, in grade 10. So I would say that these gaps being somewhat smaller in grade 10 has something to do with the fact that the standards are not quite as rigorous as they are for students in grades 3 to 8.
Okay.
I mean, I would let my other colleagues speak to that as well. But.
I think that's the best hypothesis for that.
Okay, and could we see, now, is this factoring in Park as well, or is this just MCAS?
For grade 10, it's just MCAS.
Okay.
But for grades 3 to 8, it's factoring in both MCAS and Park.
Okay. So what would this graph look like from 2008 to 2012?
So I don't have all of that data on me, but my memory is that it's been pretty steady incremental
Same.
growth.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, one thing that is worth saying is that on the nation's report card, our NAEP assessment, we've been, Boston's participated in that for many years, and we have made incremental growth, but actually caught up to the national average. So there's no statistical significant difference from the average performance of fourth graders in reading in Boston Public Schools from the national average, not just from the average of other urban districts, but from the national average. So definitely long-term trends have been positive.
Okay. And I guess the same holds true for math then. So we need to do a better job with math because, again, there's a wider gap there. And if you could provide me with that. And Park was implemented 3 years ago now?
In 2014-15 was the first time that BPS opted to take Park across all grades 3 to 8. And actually students in high school also, some schools opted in to take it in those high school grades. Last year in the 15-16 year, just all students took it in grades 3 to 8. Again, BPS opted into that. And this year, all districts across Massachusetts are taking next generation MCAS.
And I think at the time when it was first initiated, there was anxiety over being maybe more rigorous and our scores going down. Do we have any data on that?
Well, so the proficiency levels are not really comparable between MCAS and Park. And so certainly if you were to try to compare the percent of students who are proficient in grades 3 to 8, ELA or math, versus those who met expectations, which is level 4 and 5 on Park, you would see a drop. But that's true for, I believe, every district that took Park in Massachusetts. So that's why they've come up with a measure where it's really something that they've basically created a concordance table where you can compare MCAS and Park so that we're not sort of struggling with that, the changes in the
So it's
leveling.
blended? Is it a blended?
Basically, they found the corollary score from the historic MCAS tests in each grade to the Park tests, so that we know that students who got, a 700 on the Park, that would have correlated to a,
Right,
something
gotcha.
else on the MCAS, and that's how we've created this CPI index that can be looked at over time.
Great. Okay. Chair recognizes Councilor Flaherty.
Pick a grade, third grade, fourth grade, and the first day or the first week of school, say a teacher may notice something and or talk to the parents, and then you start the IEP process. Realistically, that process, my point of view, it takes too long. It's like a slow dance. And it's most instances, it's not till well after Christmas that we actually have a plan in place, but this child's going to school every day, September, October, November, December, and then after break comes back with a plan. And I think there's a lot of lost time, lost learning time there. We're not addressing sort of the core issue. So, and we're dealing with one now where I think their IEP or the team meeting is not till June for a placement or to address an issue in the fall. And part of the problem is that there's several team members and all the schedules conflict with each other and trying to coordinate a time. So I guess my point is, through the chair, is how do we streamline this IEP process so that when a teacher identifies something or a parent identifies something, that within a relatively short period of time, clearly there's the medical piece of it, there's the evaluation piece of it, it has to be expedited. We can't let a child languish for months until we come up with a plan. That has to be a much faster process.
Yeah. So just, I think as for any student, we always want to make sure that the supports and services are, and the students are provided to the student as soon as we possibly can. I think the valuable thing about assessment data and assessment information lets us know what we need to be able to address and target. And so we want to make sure that we are also clearly informed of what those things are, because it can be very simple or it can be very complex. However, I will say that BPS's turnaround around IEPs being completed is at a quicker rate than federal guidelines require us. However, we also have mechanisms in place that if we know there's a student who has high-level needs, we work through, whether it's our psych office or work through our related services office, to get these kinds of assessments done more quickly and expedited, as you said. But I think if you're finding that a particular person is not able to schedule their IEPs sooner because of scheduling conflicts, I would love to know about that. And like Cindy Nielsen, who's our Assistant Superintendent of Special Education, would also want to be informed of that. So be happy to talk to you about that individual case. But we try very hard to make sure these mechanisms get in place. I think one thing we're finding as far as not scheduling per se sometimes, but it's also the issue of this year we had a couple of coordinators that manage, are the administrators over the IEPs that have had particular needs that they've had to, personal needs they've had to take care of, and that may have caused a couple bumps in certain schools and people having to cover. So we have experienced some of that this year, which is not common in school districts, but nevertheless doesn't make it any easier for families as we're trying to move this process faster. But if you have a particular case, I would love to hear about it as well.
Okay, great. And then do we require eye exams for our students?
And Maureen can definitely talk more about that, or Amalio. But we do have eye exams that happen for schools. Maureen, would you like to come up and share a little bit more about that? That'd be
Right, and
great.
the issue is raised, a number of parents have raised this issue with me, that their child just needed eyeglasses. Their kid was sitting in the back of the classroom, and everyone thought they had all kinds of special needs, and they just needed a pair of glasses to see the chalkboard.
Yeah.
And their grades literally did like a 180.
Right.
So here you have parents sort of not even realizing that their child just needs a pair of eyeglasses, and they started going down this whole IAP route, thinking that there was all these
they
other
thought
issues. It was just a pair of glasses.
Right.
So I guess
And Maureen
that's-
works very
It's happened
closely.
in multiple situations, so how much is that magnified? And if we're not requiring folks to have an eye exam,
Great
then
question.
we ought to
Right.
do that. So
I'll let Maureen answer.
Well, we are in health services. We're required within the first 45 days to do all our new kindergartners that come into the district.
Right.
We also partner with a number of outside agencies to come and help us get all of our 57,000 students screened. So we work with New England College of Optometry, we work with 2020, and we have a new company coming in next week. In addition, we have health paras that help our nurses to screen all the students. So, we do go around and ask the teachers if you think there's someone that we need to test earlier, to bring them to the health office's attention. But we do, try our best to screen everybody early in the year.
that's great. So there's sort of, so I'm understanding, so there's a series of sort of public-private partnerships that exist that,
Right.
allow
We're
us to
required
do-
to screen all of our students, so we start in September. But obviously, we have to focus on the kindergartners first, where that's a state mandate. And then we work with our partnerships to get into the schools and help us provide the glasses if they don't have insurance.
and just, other than the kindergarten, does the state mandate any other eye testing?
Oh, we mandate that we test all of the children, but it's just the kindergartens have to be done within the first 45 days.
But when we mandate, are we testing every single year, or every couple of years, or every 3-4 years? or is-
We're attempting to do every year. Do we get every 57,000 student between the partnerships and, everything that else that goes on? I'll be honest, we probably don't get to every student, but,
Sure.
we do our best.
Great, I appreciate that. I obviously see Rick Durain here, so I know he does a nice job making sure that our kids have good playing surfaces and good fields throughout the year. But I noticed in the budget that there's only an increase of 58,000 for school sports. And there's a huge correlation between whether a kid stays in school or doesn't, whether a kid gets a scholarship or doesn't, whether a kid goes on to college or doesn't, based on school sports. And that's been probably since the beginning of time. And so you might have sort of a kid that may not be performing well academically, but performs well athletically. There's a connection there through either a coach or a mentor or even a teacher, keeping that kid focused, finishing class, getting better grades, doing the homework, so that that child can compete on the court or on the ice or on the field. And so a little disappointed to see that in a $1 billion budget, we're only ticking it up $58,000 with 57 students in the school system. So through the chair and vice chair, I'd like to try to address that issue between now and budget vote time. I just think that that's a paltry. And then shifting to health and wellness, and you can answer them both at the same time, then there's a big drop of about $250,000 drop from 1.7 down to 1.4, and I believe that there was some type of grant that we've, PICH grant, at a time when, if you just think about substance abuse and treatment and the opioid crisis that's out on the streets, and then you see on page 4, it's screening, brief intervention, referral for treatment use piloted in high schools with grade 9 students. What about the 10th graders, the 11th graders, the 12th graders? What are we doing around treatment and recovery? What are we doing around drug and alcohol awareness and education? And seeing that there's a $250,000 drop in the health and wellness as well as in the health services, I'd throw a caution flag up there, just given the quantity and the potency of the substances that are on the streets. And again, so if they're not down at the ball fields or on the court or on the ice, staying out of trouble, staying away from the gang activity and the drug activity, because we're only giving them 58 extra thousand. And then you have someone that has a treatment and recovery issue, but we've cut that by $250,000. I find that just a sort of a perilous road here. And I think that both school sports and athletics and also drug and alcohol awareness and treatment is being lost in the shuffle here as we're focusing on other stuff that I think both of these issues have a huge impact on one's success in the classroom, as well as one's ability to graduate and one's ability to go on to college, to potentially gain a scholarship and or potentially compete in the global economy. And I think we fail those kids if we're not providing enough sports and also enough treatment and recovery awareness. So thank you.
Thank you.
Could we get an answer for the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. I
Great,
thought you
thank-
were, I thought you were done.
Yeah, I want to talk about why the athletic budget is only $58,000 compared to last year increase. I also want to see why we lost $250,000 on treatment, recovery, substance abuse awareness.
Yeah.
I apologize, Counselor, it sounded like a
all right.
rhetorical question.
No problem.
No, and we'll transition a bit, because the presentation on social emotional learning, so we'll ask some folks to move up so they can go into more of the details.
So Council, there is a second presentation that they haven't done yet.
Okay.
I believe that's the handout that you have. So maybe we could just wrap up, Nicole, before you go, we can wrap up any outstanding questions on this initial presentation, which I have a few, so if that would be okay?
Sure.
When schools, so Nicole, I think this question is actually for you anyway.
Okay.
There are some conflicting levels and tiers between what the state designates a school and what the district designates a school. Can you talk a little bit about those, how schools get ranked? But then also, I understand that so a school could be ranked level 1 according to the State Department of Ed, but BPS is still basing some of their tiers on old data. How do we reconcile that?
So you are bringing up the larger issue of the tiers that are assigned for student assignment and school choice, and the fact that that is a BPS specific measure, and it's different than the state. One of the biggest differences is that the tiers assigned by the state are ranking schools relative to all other schools in the state. Using grade configuration as sort of like a control there. When we do our MCAS tiers, or school quality framework tiers, is what we will be implementing next year. Those are just comparing students within BPS, and knowing that for our student assignment and school choice process, we need to have a tiering system that's internal to BPS. That's one of the biggest differences. There is, in terms of the lagging data, if that's what you're asking about, some of this is based on there's been a postponement of the school quality framework, given some enhancements that we would like to consider. The school quality working group was reconvened to rethink that. But one of the main reasons why there was a postponement was because of the shifts in our state assessments. And so that's really the reason why we have lagging data.
But is it possible for the state to have a school at a level 1 and BPS to have a school at a level 3? Because that's my understanding is that's what's happening at like the Russell, for example. And that's a problem because it does affect the assignment process and enrollment over time.
Mm-hmm. So it is possible. Some of the other differences between the BPS specific measure is that we weight student growth much more heavily than the state does. The state weights student performance. So if a school happens to have students at the school that are on average higher performing, but may not be growing at the same rate as another school based on our student growth measure, that might be one reason why you'd see some differences. So does that answer your question?
I mean, it answers the question, but it still highlights the problem or the conflict with those two tiered systems, because
Yes.
there is a role that the BPS designation plays. But if we're ranking our school at a 3 and the state's ranking a school as a level 1, parents aren't, I guess they're getting a more confusing picture of what the quality of that school really is. But then the other concern I have is how it affects the assignment process and what families see as choices. Because in some districts there are so many BPS level 3 schools that parents are only seeing sort of a selected one, and that's affecting enrollment at the other schools. And we know that enrollment affects budgets, which are, so it's this problem that exists that we just need to figure out a way to fix it.
Yeah, so one last piece on this is that I do agree with you that it's very complex, especially from the perspective of a parent or family. There are many different data points that a parent or family could use to make their decisions, but these...
Well, only if they're allowed to see it as an option.
Absolutely.
You can't
So
make
the
a choice
list.
on something you can't see or have as
That's right.
an option.
So the data point that is being used to generate their list is an internal BPS measure. There is an evaluation that is an RFP for an evaluation of home-based student assignment that will be going out this spring, and the evaluation, my understanding is that it will be starting in the fall. And I think that your question around the trying to somehow measure the extent to which potential conflicts in these tiers may actually contribute to some impacts on the extent to which families get access to equitably get access to seats for their students, to high quality seats, is a really nuanced question, and I will let the folks know who are putting out that RFP. I think it's a question that I haven't asked before, and so I appreciate it.
No, thank you. And then on the online testing for MCAS, the goal to reach it by 2009, are we going to see an uptick in the number of IEPs and 504s that are going to request kids take it paper and pencil as opposed to electronic? And what will that demand on the IEP and the 504 system? Are we going to be able to handle those requests?
That's a good question. Will the actual transition to online testing increase the number of students who have it in their IEP to take paper-based testing?
Well, I'd
I
say that
actually don't
it's
know
not currently, because we don't do it online.
Right.
That isn't in an IEP or a 504. I happen to have one of my kids as a 504, that it is a paper, and it's been highlighted, MCAS Online is coming. We've got to update his 504 for paper and pencil because it wouldn't be great for him to do it online.
Yeah.
So I've got to go in now as a parent and request that change. I think we're going to see that demand as we go more and more online with MCAS.
Yeah.
That kids are going to get that request.
If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to take this question back and also collaborate with Cindy Nielsen a little bit to try to.
I think it's less of,
approximate.
I don't need a response, I just need to know that you're prepared for it.
Yeah.
If it's a legitimate
appropriate,
concern.
IEP teams have already been coached on beginning to have, since last year in preparation for the shift, to have those kinds of conversations as part of the IE team process. But I don't know if there's been like a big increase or decrease. I mean, we could look into
Try to
that.
look at that.
Okay.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
then my final question on your budget summary, just on your presentation itself, can you talk about the shifts between FY17 adopted versus FY17 current? I'm assuming there was a different department yesterday that had a mid-year change, and how it relates to what you're asking for in fiscal year 18. I don't know who that goes to.
I'm happy to take that one if you guys want. So this is a standard practice that we do throughout our reporting. The budget that's adopted before the start of the fiscal year is different than it is at a point in time. So natural course of doing business, we create reserves, for instance, at this time of the year for things for which we don't have information. So a great example is we hold some students in reserve, for instance, because we don't know exactly what schools they're going to attend. We give ourselves a little buffer with our projections. Again, standard practice that we do every year. So if you looked at the adopted budget, you would see a reserve for students. But then after the start of the school year, those students would have been associated with a specific school, and the budgets of those schools would be adjusted, or we would have paid money out through class size reserve. So for the purposes of trying just to inform stakeholders of how to really think about our budget, we like to provide as many data points as possible. So we do the budget that was approved a year ago at this time, where we are currently, and then the proposed budget as well.
So this is current projected what you'll finish at, or is this current what you've spent to date, and we're going to see an increase at the end of fiscal year 17?
Could you say that again?
So it says current. Is that
Yes,
this
it's what
point
we-
in time, or is
Yeah.
that what you're expecting to end at
It's
the
what
end
we
of-
expect to spend for the current
for the
fiscal year.
current fiscal year?
Another reason that it could change mid-year, for instance, our equity team referenced yesterday, we had a spike in volume in our Office of Equity work related to issues I'm sure many of you are aware of, and we just made an emergency mid-year decision to beef up the resources in that team. That kind of change is unusual and very small in context of the $1 billion budget. Most of the change is due to the liquidation of reserves.
Yep, and this change here from what was adopted and what's current is not, I don't think it's necessarily significant, but there's probably a dollar amount if there were a significant shift over the course of the year that I think us as a council, and certainly as a Ways and Means Committee, should be made aware of. But I don't know what that dollar amount is, and that's perhaps something that we discuss
Yep,
as a
absolutely.
committee. But this is just the second time that we've seen that in this budget process so far.
And we also provide monthly budget updates in writing to the school committee to let them know, with a $1 billion budget, we do our best to hit the budget with every line item that we can. But again, the normal course of doing business, we have some things that come in slightly above or below. utilities, gas prices,
Right,
or some
right.
things that we don't know. And so we highlight in our monthly letter to school committee where things are coming out above and below.
Is there a dollar amount that the school committee has identified as significant enough to have a formal conversation about?
Not in the 2 years since I've been here, no. We haven't had, they don't have a standard level that triggers that kind of conversation. We have at times had one-off conversations on issues of interest to the school committee.
That is it for me in this round.
Thank you.
Council Jackson's.
Did Council
Oh,
Presley
no.
go?
I'm sorry.
Council Presley. Okay, Councilor Jackson.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I also wanted to dig in on a couple pieces. One, I love going each year to the valedictorian luncheon, and I think one of it is the highlight of my year, especially because I was not a valedictorian. So what I find amazing, and this is a credit to BPS. I think 2/3 of the young people, and maybe I was wrong, but were FELL students, so the former English language learners. So a really interesting stat, and it's not enumerated here, but I've seen in other decks, is that our FELL students actually do 10 points higher on average in English language arts. So I ingest, ask, well, why don't we just have everyone go through ELL, and then we could raise all of our scores. But I think there's really there's a there, right? And so I think what are some of the learnings that we have? We know that language takes 5 to 7 years to acquire, but what are some of the things that we can explore and extrapolate out of that? I think the ELL movement has been amazing, and it not only has been amazing for the deep dive in pedagogy, but also something that has also been accommodating with culture and families. And I don't know that we have actually done that with other cultures across the board. So I guess what are some of the things that you see there? Because that's a win. That's an amazing factor that is very real. What can we learn from that data point that we can scale to ensure that we have mobility and close the achievement gap across the board?
So what you see when students are bilingual, you actually see their ability to think more critically, be able to communicate and be able to, because they're switching from different languages. There's been great neuroscience research coming out regarding how the bilingual brain can really develop in many other areas beyond just language. So that would be first. I think one of the things that from that learning is why we also want to expand more dual language programs across our school system. I think there is more opportunities for the 21st century that we know we need to ensure our students have the ability to speak in multiple languages, engage with different cultures and diversity of people. The other thing that we're also noticing, though, is that the sooner we're focused on intervening for our English learners on language development as well as access to the core instruction, which are two different styles of instruction that we have to be aware of, we're seeing that we still, though, have a lot of work to do in targeting our students who are long-term English learners. So you'll see that more evident in our high school data, where you'll have students who've been in the system and have not reclassified. And so we're fully where we need to make sure we're doing targeted work on that. And Dr. Sparsa, when she does her presentation, can go more into what we're doing specifically. So we're aware and we're very proud of that work, but we also know there's more to do there. And I think the other, I will hand over to Donnie to go into what else have we been learning around how being able to provide instruction for our ELs actually are great instructional strategies, also for our students with disabilities, also for our general population students who just learn differently, and the work that the asset team, in particular with the academic shop, that we're doing right now.
So I think what goes for the bilingual brain that Dr. Estrada just talked about goes actually for a lot of cross-disciplinary work. When you think about arts integration, science integration, history integration, when you engage multiple parts of the brain, you're more likely to get these rich learning experiences that show up in data like this. And so we've been building upon that sort of interdisciplinary work, building units of study that try to get at that interdisciplinarity. Also thinking about these core teaching practices, and this gets a little bit back to Councillor Campbell's question around where this shows up. We have encapsulated a series of access practices that live in the context of a lesson plan, right? When you think about where the rubber meets the road for instruction, it's a lesson plan. And so it asks and prompts teachers to think about who's in front of them, what's going to help a kid, this child or this set of children learn, and then enumerates some of the key practices that a teacher can use to make sure that you are overcoming any barrier that that student might have. When we start to collaborate, we have already begun collaborating and will continue the collaboration between academics, ELL, special education, CELWELL, to integrate all of those practices together and put them in the context of the curriculum that teachers are seeing every day.
Do you have for academics right now? There's a very efficient 1 FTE. Considering that, yeah. So okay, and I get it. So academics is what we do, right? So this is the school department. So I guess I want to understand. You're amazing. You're great.
Thank you, Councilor.
But how is it that we only have 1 FTE in academics? And I understand. I see that there's more that we're adding. How did we only have 1? And what do the additional folks do? Are we going to triple the scores?
So let me just clarify a little bit about how these FTEs are allocated. So academics is currently housed me, but now is going to also house several of my sort of direct leadership team. That's that jump from 1 to 4. But academics also encompasses instructional research and development, which are the content departments, which is the larger number of FTEs that you see here, and early learning, which has also a lot of content expertise plus coaches, all of which work together to ensure that K-12 academic experience.
But then I guess my question is, with the instructional research and development, that's going down from 4,235,310 to 4,190,662. And the data and accountability is going up a little bit. I just think that we need to be mindful, because this is literally the core of what you do, right? So when I see drops, and Councilor Flaherty brought up also the athletics, and we're going to get there, but if you do academics. And so when I see shifts downward there, that to me is alarming. And the question is, through the vantage points of the requirement to look at things through the opportunity and achievement gap, what does that mean on the ground for folks? I just want you to be very mindful in that, and to be able to explain. The last piece I'll just bring up is that there's been a online versus paper differential relative to scores. When you give young people the testing, the PARCC test online versus on paper, there's a gap there, and they do better on paper. That speaks to me, that's saying that we need to do better with blended learning, and we need more ubiquitous access to technology for every single young person, because unlike us, many of them, if you gave it to them on their phone, they'd be absolutely fine. But many of them haven't used the trackpad, and we heard yesterday a lot of the blended learning that we have is punitive. It's credit recovery. So their access to tech in many regards is either testing or a punitive measure for them to catch back up. That's not there's 1.4 million open jobs in that space, right? So we need to associate, and inadvertently, we're actually making that connection that technology is either burdensome or bad in some way. So we need to do a better job there. And I think that would also mean that scores would go up just based on the fact that they would have that connection. I'm getting a side eye right now, but I think that is a really important component relative to that. And we should have six languages in Boston Public Schools should actually start in middle school. There are many other large urban districts, including Baltimore, and right next door in Brookline, where I went to school, we started languages actually in middle school. You're saying that the bilingual brain, things kind of connect better there. We should actually make that connection better. And we should make sure that every single one of our high schools are able to keep the languages that they have and they're not cutting back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Counselor Campbell.
Thank you, Councilor Siomo. Just sort of picking up on my questions from before, just sort of barriers, best practices, in some specific terms that we could also, of course, engage with our constituents and our parents on would be very helpful.
So I can speak to a little bit of this. So I want to reference back to the point that Carla made a moment ago around the holistic nature of the Opportunity and Achievement Gap policy. I'm going to make it very concrete, and because this sort of linearness of this makes a lot of sense to me, and you can prompt me for additional clarity if you need it. So the Office of Human Capital, their goal within the OAG implementation plan is to increase the diversity of our teaching pool. And so they are compelled by that policy to adjust all sorts of practices and layer on training and accountability to school leaders for whom this is the responsibility. And so then the rest of the system then has to orient around enforcing that level of accountability and providing that level of support. But a great teacher in the classroom, even if they have all the raw materials and they reflect the diversity of the students in front of them, still needs training and support and the right instructional materials, which I can say with honesty and clarity and transparency, not all of our curriculum is culturally and linguistically sustaining. And so that's a barrier. And so my department is undertaking a process of auditing and decolonizing, to use very plain language, the curriculum, which is a barrier. But even if they have the right stuff, so you got the right person, you got the right stuff, they actually need the training to enact that stuff effectively in the classroom and to adjust their practices to the students that are in front of them. So that sort of chain, which implicates so many central office departments, it articulates both barriers and denotes who has responsibility for removing some of those barriers. So the Office of Human Capital, academics, all of asset, and then the data and accountability piece to make sure that we are setting up cycles of improvement, because nobody's going to be perfect right out of the gate. And
What, just to, to save time, I know there's more presentations today. What would be helpful is, every department, if I picked up what you were saying, it plays a role, obviously, in closing the achievement gap.
That's right.
What would be helpful is a document that spells out what each department's role is in doing that in specific terms that we could have conversations around, and what their timeline is in the larger plan. That document would be very useful, not only I think for me, my colleagues, but also for constituents, for parents,
We'd love it.
and frankly, anyone who cares about this issue. So I'd love to see something like that, because obviously we could be here all day talking about barriers, best practices, but that would be useful to have. And so I'm going to, through the chair, recommend or request that of you guys. And then just sort of asking a few other questions. And thank you for that summary. That was very helpful in thinking about the stuff, who's the right person, but how every department plays a role, which is great. Quickly, this is just high level. What's the total number of BPS students right now?
We have approximately 57,000.
Okay.
BPS.
11,000 of those are ELLs. This was from earlier.
I want to confirm, about 30% of our students. So it's a little higher than that.
Our ELL.
Our ELLs, I think it's about 15,000, something like that.
About 15,000.
It's about 15,000. It's about 30% of all of our students.
And about 4,000 of those English language learners
With
have
disabilities.
IEPs.
Yes.
How many students on IEPs out of that 57,000?
It's about
20%,
20% of our students, so
About
About 11
11,000.
That's what I was gonna say, yeah.
you're testing my numerization
yeah.
memory over here this
And
morning.
then what's the breakdown of those students by race?
So I don't have that broken down right now, but I can get that to you guys by the end of the morning.
Okay, awesome, thank
Yeah.
you. And then lastly, what's the fastest growing population out of those subsets within the BPS? Is it students with, is it our English language learners? Is it our,
We've had a relatively consistent percentage of students who have IEPs for the last couple of years. We've had a very significant jump in our students who we classify as English language learners in the last 6 years. That's due in part because of how we classify, not necessarily the students that we're serving. And so it's been a little hard, as at least from finances, we've looked at the data to pull apart the differences in actual changing demographics versus how we classify students. I'll let the
Yeah,
team
no,
finish anything.
that's
Okay.
exactly right.
and do we keep track of those students who are currently on IEPs, whose IEPs are not being satisfied by the district, who aren't receiving all of their services within their IEP?
So if there's a student who, for whatever reason, let's say someone goes on maternity leave or, has had surgery or something like that and is supposed to be providing services, we track that and then be able to provide somebody who can provide those services, or we offer compensatory time for those folks who have missed any kind of services. We work very diligently to find out if there's a student who's not receiving a service for us to know about it. This is why I always say, like, if there's a student that is, then we need to know about it. But if there is something that we have systems that actually track what are the services and who's been completing those services, has to be logging those minutes and things like that. So
Well,
we
I
have
will
a
say, I
data
mean, as a
tracking
former
system.
education attorney, I'm putting that hat on, who represents students largely against BPS. We solved a lot of problems
Yeah.
together. There were a lot of students that we had who were on IEPs who did not get the services as articulated in their IEP. And sometimes that was lack of resources. Sometimes that was the school didn't have the power, didn't have the human capital. It was a whole combination of things. Sometimes the district, the school and the parent may have agreed this is what we need, but the district was hesitant to add that service, but didn't fulfill the obligation. So I'm curious on a high level if we know, of the 11,000 students with IEPs, what percentage of those students aren't getting their services? Obviously, there are parents in the district who I'm sure if we asked this question to them would come running
Right.
saying, my student. And if we don't track it, that's fine. It's just, it's a question because then we need to think critically about what we do in terms of resources or whatever else to meet that need where there is a gap.
Yeah. I would ask that, I will definitely take that question. We have the special ed team coming at our next academic presentation, so I'll front load them with this question, just like the question on overdue IEP. So, because I know we have data systems, but I would say Cindy's probably the best person to get into more of the details of numbers and how we track it and compensatory time and things like that.
Very helpful. And then I just have two last questions. One is, obviously standards vary across schools. And that's a big concern for me. And what I mean by that is, I went to 5 BPS schools, but including Boston Latin School. I had friends and colleagues who went to different high schools that received different academic instruction. And I have hired some BPS students who were leaving the system with at different levels. Some of these students obviously graduate from BPS, go off to college, and have to take remedial classes. So there are two questions sort of built into this. One is, what are we doing to address standards that differ across our schools? And two, what are we doing for those students who are graduating from our high schools but are going to community colleges and have to immediately start with remedial classes and have to usually pay for those and sometimes drop out because of the frustration? What's happening around that? And if this is not the appropriate panel, I can hold that question too. I just assumed it was performance academics.
So,
And those are my last two questions.
for consistency, I'll actually return to that idea of like right people, right stuff, right training as an organizing framework for my response. We need to make sure that the highest quality teachers are distributed across our schools equitably. I think that's something that I know that OHC is actively looking at. Secondly, we are currently and actively solving for the inconsistency of instructional materials across buildings. For example, to address directly the high school point you're making, we are adopting new math curricula that is more ambitious, more integrated, more cross-curricular for ninth grade, and then rolling that up through the grades, which getting the right stuff in there with the right people, with the right training will help to make sure that all students are graduating college and career ready. We are also undertaking a process to revise graduation requirements to make sure that, to Counselor Jackson's point before, that we honor many different types of learning and different types of learning experience. We treat the city as a classroom. We honor and encourage blended learning experiences and project-based learning and workplace learning, all of these linked learning pathways. I mean, lots of different types of learning. As a way of making sure that high school is as relevant and as rigorous as it needs to be. So that's a policy process that we are engaging in actively. On top of this whole, let's make sure the instructional materials are right and that the teachers are trained to use them in a way that differentiates meaningfully for all the students in front of them.
And that's helpful. And in providing the achievement gap and the role each department plays,
Right.
what would also be helpful, sort of as an appendix to that, is the schools that you mentioned that are closing the achievement gap on a daily basis, particularly those within Boston. Would love to see what schools those are. I think I have an idea of some of those schools, because I think that's also useful too. Thank you so much, and thank you for your presentation today. Thank you, Counselor Siomo.
Counselor Flaherty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just still waiting for my questions on the athletics piece and the health and wellness. If we could could you skip over, could you fast forward and just answer those questions?
Sure. Well, first, one of the things in terms of our athletics piece is that there's some barriers to athletics that are more than just the funding. One is the fields and the facilities. And then there's a piece about whether there's a demand for certain pieces. But one of the things that Avery Isdale, who is our Senior Director for Athletics, has been working on is developing public-private partnerships so that way we can continue to grow our athletics program. And I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think the only other piece that should be noted about our budget, we've been fortunate enough to be level funded, excuse me, the last few years. So when looking at the increases and pieces that come with it, those are attached to, and most likely attached to the stipends that we pay to the coaches. The other piece that Amalio did touch on that we do have to consider when talking about athletics is we're not we don't operate on our own. You know, there's other pieces, other capacity pieces in the district that we have to be aware of and that we have to move in unison with. The transportation department, safety, facilities, all take on different pieces when we look at adding programs or changing pieces around or dealing with different parts of athletics. So just as you've highlighted it, it is an important piece and a piece that we do feel very passionate about, and we know the virtues of athletics and what it can create in terms of giving kids different connections to schools and the leverage points that it can create in a school building and amongst the different adults and people that they interact with. We also have to work through that strategically to make sure that we go through it in a place that we can sustain it, and also that it's something that we're in a position to take advantage of and do correctly.
And has there been an assessment of equipment and uniforms? I know the cost of ice rental and court rental and field rental has gone up.
Yeah, yeah.
All those costs continue to rise, and I look and there's only an additional $58,000 in the budget from last year. I have to assume that that's not sufficient to fix the uniforms and to update the equipment and provide for sufficient court rental and field rental and ice rental for our sports teams.
Yeah, equipment-wise, we have the teams on a rotation where we've identified each of the sports and laid out in a 5 to 6 year period when we will purchase new uniforms for the teams, so they're aware of that. Equipment-wise, each team currently works under the guise that they make the decision based on varying budgets around each sport in terms of what they need to have their sport. But you are correct. Price of ice, price of rentals, price of officials, all to go up. And that's a piece that I'm sure we're dealing with district wide. So we work and try to find ways to adequately reflect what our spending is going to be. But those are pieces that's cost of goods and supplies and everything are going up.
And we get some good teams that advance. They advance pretty far into the playoffs, into the through the MIAA and things like that. So making sure that they have the support from the school district, I think, is important particularly when they're playing against other school communities or the suburbs. We can't show up looking like the Bad News Bears. That's important for morale and for school spirit. So I think that's important to note. As teams are advancing and they're doing well, that we're supporting them, whether that's through equipment and uniforms or increasing field and court and ice rental as they're preparing for the state tournament, so they can advance through the state tournament and maybe even hopefully raise a banner for the state tournament. So I just want to make sure that we're mindful of that, and also the role that athletics plays in students' ability to perform in the classroom and to stay in school and to graduate and potentially get a scholarship to help their family send them off to school. So everything's interrelated, and I just thought 58,000 was somewhat paltry. I know you mentioned some private partnerships, but if those partnerships don't deliver, I'd like to see a little bit bigger number for our athletics. And if we can shift, the follow-up question was on the health and wellness. We see a $250,000 drop around sort of that health and wellness, and I'm seeing a big need in our city around treatment and recovery, particularly around drug and alcohol awareness and education, treatment and recovery. Particularly for our adolescents. I mean, not only the substances more potent and voluminous on the streets, but the kids are getting their hands on these things at a younger age than, say, when we were in school. So I guess what are we doing? And shouldn't just be limited to ninth graders. We should be dipping this down to 6th, 7th, and 8th, and we should probably not forget our sophomores, juniors, and seniors. So if someone can talk to me about that $250,000 cut and what we're doing to put our best foot forward when we're educating our kids about the inherent dangers of drug and alcohol abuse.
Sure. Hi, my name is Jill Carter.
Hi, Jill.
I'm going to speak a little bit to the drop in the budget for the Health and Wellness Department, and just to say that the Health and Wellness Department budget covers the central supports for health education, physical education, and wellness policy and promotion and physical activity. So in terms of that specific decrease, the budget from the district actually has not decreased at all. Our funding is a combination of district funded as well as a number of other federal and nonprofit, a lot of different grants. What you're seeing here is the fact that one of our grants is ending in the end of September. It's a grant that we get through the Health Commission, and it funds Safe Routes to School. We do anticipate having some additional funding from another source that could help partly mitigate that decrease. Some other things that can contribute to where this looks like a decrease, just some of our other grant funds aren't fully loaded yet. And so we haven't seen a decrease in district funding. And again, with the grants, there will be some decline, but we hope to make up for that with other grants. That's the question you have about in terms of the money side of things. I think the broader question about substance abuse prevention and all of that, the health education direction for the district is we want to expand health education, which includes substance abuse prevention. The piece that you mentioned is you brought out the point that the Health Services Department is doing work around SBIRT, which is the substance abuse prevention intervention, screening, prevention, and intervention. And that is a pilot program that if you want to know a little more about that, I would ask Maureen Stark, our Senior Director for Health Services, to come down and talk to you a little bit about the rollout of that program.
Okay. And then can you just tell me a little bit about the Safe Route program?
Sure.
So that's no longer, so the program that we have now is no longer going to be funded because of the cut to the PICH?
So we anticipate having some other funds to help us bridge that. We do hope to keep that program going as we continue to seek funding for that. At this point, we're feeling pretty hopeful that we will have some funding. It won't continue in exactly the same manner we have been able to do this year because that federal grant is closing at the end of September, and they're not going to
What is the program? What's the Safe Route to School program?
Safe Routes to School, we have sort of a citywide, a district-wide, and a school-based strategies. And what we're trying to do is increase awareness of the benefits of walking, biking, and taking public transport to school. We're doing pedestrian safety training for students in elementary and middle schools. We're also working with schools to develop safe routes maps with some schools. So that there's a lot of community input onto what are the safer ways to walk. We also work with a number of city agencies around the safety, both from a personal safety as well as from traffic safety. So working through Vision Zero, as well as the Boston Public Health Commission and the Boston Police Department. We've had 22 schools did a Walk to School Day, which a lot of folks participated in across the city. So it's a combination of education, promotion, evaluation, and enforcement, and it's a national model that we're working to implement here in Boston.
Great.
Hi, I'm Maureen Stark, and I'm going to answer your question on ESPER, which is screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment for substance use. And that was a law signed into effect by Governor Baker last year. And it's an unfunded mandate, but next year it will be required by law that we screen all 7th and 9th graders for substance use. And it's not a testing, it's a conversation. There's a tool where you want to have positive conversations with youth around their drug use or potential drug use. This will be started next year in full force. This year we're piloting it. We did get some money last year from the state to, get everything translated into multiple language for our opt-outs, to do trainings for the people that are going to do the screening, which are our school nurses, our school psychologists. We also had to have trainings for headmasters so they would be able to explain to parents what ESPER was. So we are planning on going forward next year because it will be a law next year. But again, it's an unfunded mandate. So, we are hoping we will get some funding perhaps from the state to help us coordinate it better.
That's great. And any idea what that would cost for 7th graders and 9th graders?
There's no, I don't think there's a cost per se. It'll be built into the screenings that we do for, vision, hearing, BMI. It'll become routine, hopefully, and not found as, because kids are willing to talk. But I think what we're looking for is to help us with coordination because it's mostly logistics, finding the space, finding the time, the planning. And then obviously afterwards, the education piece. I think what we've found from a small pilot is that we need more education around marijuana use.
Great. Okay.
And if I can just add, we certainly are addressing substance abuse prevention through our health education curriculum, through our safe and welcoming school centers for students who are committing violations of the code of conduct and are caught with substances. So we have counselors on site at the Safe and Welcoming School Center. And Maureen did a great job last year. She received some special funding to roll out the ESPERT initiative. And so we were able to purchase curriculum and resources for all the departments. And I know that our behavioral health department has also played a role in the rollout. So again, through the Office of SalWell, all of my departments have been collaborating to address this piece.
And what will the school, moving forward, because you raised the issue about marijuana, what will the school policy be moving forward with respect to marijuana now that it's on the recreational side of the house? Are we still allowing that to prevent that from coming into school?
You still have to be 21.
Okay.
You can't come to school under the influence.
Yeah, but we have, I believe we have, I think Councilor Jackson referenced at a hearing recently that we do have some students in our Boston Public Schools that are older. I don't know if they make the 21 cut, but
There's a policy, a tobacco-free environment policy that we passed in 2013 or 12, which is really strong on all types of other tobacco products, as well as tobacco products, as well as marijuana. It covers a range of those. I think that, we should always review those policies with new law changes, and I know that that is a conversation that's already started in the district.
Does that include the vape pens that now seem to be sort of a popular craze right now?
Yeah.
Is that included in that ban as well?
I think I would have to look closely at that language, but definitely that was the intent when the policy was developed. This is there's a lot of emerging different types of products, so we do need to keep up with that.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Council Presley. Sorry.
Just skip around. There's one question.
Counselor.
Relative to dropout, I have had the pleasure of attending the all-city commencement exercises, which are an incredible display of students that we have been able to successfully re-engage, who've often dropped out due to disruptive circumstances. Especially heartening to me to see so many young moms graduating that day that many discounted, but who made it. And so I wanted to know, could you speak to the percentage of pregnant and parenting teens that you've currently had to re-engage and successfully have done so? I know these numbers can be harder to quantify, but because they do represent so many of our students that we have to re-engage, our teen pregnancy numbers have dropped, but teen pregnancy still remains the number one reason that girls do drop out. So.
I'm sorry, Councilor Presley, can you just restate
Sure,
the beginning
I
of the
just want to
question?
know, as I said, I've attended the all-city graduation many times, which is an incredible demonstration of our success in re-engaging students who have dropped out. Teen pregnancy, although our numbers have declined considerably, it still remains the number one reason girls drop out. And I've done a lot of work with BPS and with advocates to strengthen pathways to graduation for expectant and parenting teens. In fact, we worked for 3 years together to update the expectant and parenting teen policy. And I would like to know if it is working. So if both the educators are being trained on the policy, if students are aware of it, and if we have seen that yield relative to outcomes.
So I can speak to the implementation of the policy, the impact on the numbers of the graduation numbers that you asked for. I'll have to ask if someone else can help me with that. But since we've passed the policy, of course, with all of your support and many other advocates in the community, we have identified liaisons. And in school year 14-15, we had 76 out of 78 schools named a liaison. And 63 out of 78 of those schools were trained. The liaisons were trained. We held additional trainings last year. Most of the schools kept their liaisons from the school year 14-15. There were some additional changes, and we were able to train the remaining number of liaisons that hadn't been trained the previous school year. We continue to communicate the policy, and our goal is to offer ongoing trainings for the schools that are where there are changes in terms of the liaisons themselves.
So are the trainings and people being well communicated to about the policy, is that optional? Is that an opt-in, opt-out? Is that mandatory? Is that considered a part of professional development?
It's mandatory that all schools have a liaison for expectant and parenting teens, and that they receive a training, and that we provide them access with the training to resources, which is what we've been doing.
Okay.
Yeah.
And can you at this time quantify the number of expectant and parenting teens currently within that 57,000 population?
No, I can't, and I don't think that we're currently tracking. I don't
I
think
know
we
it's
have a
hard, but
tracking.
Yeah.
I think we talked about that as a metric with the policy, and I don't think that's currently something that we are doing. But if
Yeah.
I can offer, if anybody
Explain.
else has some.
The one thing we do have, I was asking Nicole, and she may be able to explain it much better than I, but I will attempt. What we do track is when a student does drop out, the reason for that dropout, and if pregnancy is
That
one
would
of the
be
factors,
helpful.
then we can track that and show where along the journey they've been re-engaged. So we can see who, where, when, that kind
So
of
do you
thing.
still see it as a contributing factor?
We can be able to see, yes, and whether students were re-engaged or not, we would be able to track that data, at least if it was within a BPS system. So we can track that, but I think your question about like currently, do we know how many, and I'm even thinking of nursing, if there's any data we track in that end.
Right.
Okay. Okay.
And I think that was the issue when we were, right, when we were trying to figure out the metrics for that policy, that was a big conversation about
Sure.
tracking for the purposes that you
Absolutely.
stated, and that's why we do.
But the
Yeah.
challenge, the rib there is we want to make sure that they know it is their right to complete their education and that we are doing everything to support them in that.
That does.
Okay.
That part of those kinds of conversations, I think, lends to Jill's conversation about the policy and the great work that our nurses do in conversations
Yes,
with
they
them.
do.
So I would say that's where we do, but I think if you wanted to see the other data, I
I'd
think
be
that'd
interested
great for us
in
to track. I agree
in
with
the value added,
Mhm.
who we've been able to re-engage.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't want us to do incredible work together and pass policies and then not hold each other accountable to them being successfully implemented. So I want to know if we're successful or if there are amendments that needs to be offered or ways in which we need to tweak it. So that's why I wanted to ask those questions. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'm gonna, Counselor Flaherty was asking a number of questions on the athletics front, so I'm gonna skip over there for a second. Should I? Okay, I'm sorry. He's like, I thought I was off the hot seat. I'll make this painless. I think. Okay. And hopefully, I'm not asking you anything that requires too many crosstabs and isn't something that's already been asked and answered. So first, I want to start with a thank you for the district following up on questions and concerns raised by myself and Counselor Anissa Sabi-George relative to the girls' facilities at Madison Park High School. Again, continue to be concerned and want to make sure that when we're talking about equity, that we are in compliance with Title IX relative to boys and girls having the same athletic offerings and also having commiserate access to facilities. And so, so far as you are concerned, are we in compliance with Title IX?
In talking, yes. I mean, we've met with the equity office. We stay in connection with the equity office. We did a survey of all our high schools last spring around their facilities, around their practices, surrounding their athletics program. We're preparing to do the same survey with our middle schools around their athletic program. So, in collaboration with the equity office, we are compliant right now.
Okay. And do we have any situations, I recall in the past, oftentimes teams were sharing facilities with other schools. And I mean, and despite those challenges, they still went on to earn titles, but not optimal circumstances. Can you anecdotally or approximately speak to if this is still occurring?
Yeah, and I mean, in all honesty, for the athletic program to happen, it's gonna have to happen.
Okay.
From our standpoint, are there ways that we can creatively schedule, prepare for these opportunities, for these situations, plan them out, have the two groups sit and make sure that it works for both parties? Yes, but in order for our athletic program to be sustainable and for opportunities to be afforded to the number of schools that are interested, they're going to have to share at some point.
Okay. And I assume that this is all being factored heavily into and perhaps has its own track when we talk about the facilities plan,
Yes,
master plan. So you have your own track where this is being factored into future designs.
and I'll talk, and I don't know if anyone else wants to speak, but we have had some preliminary discussions. I've shared my ideas and views and pieces around where some of our strengths lie, where there's areas for improvement, where there's areas to get ahead of, where we currently are. I think it's a conversation that we'll need to pick up and probably solidify a little bit more, but both sides are aware
Okay.
of us as athletic.
All right, very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a number of questions in the health and wellness space. Should I be greedy since Mark is ignoring us right now? Jill, come on back. Okay. Can I get one? Okay, so let's get back to the order here. I was neglected for so long, so.
We could do the presentation and then.
Yes, which would answer a lot of our questions, I'm sure.
Yes.
Quickly, because we've already started with some of our questions anyway. Thank you.
Can we get the presentation set up?
But do they have the slides?
Okay. If you have it, then I can just go through.
Oh, here he is.
PowerPoint if you want to start.
Yeah.
Sure.
While they catch up.
So real quickly, it's just an introduction to the Office of Social Emotional Learning and Wellness. As Dr. Tran pointed out in his presentation earlier, one of the instructional competencies that he talked about was creating safe, healthy, and sustaining environments for all students. And this is one of the key focus areas in the Superintendent's Strategic Implementation Plan that focuses on promoting the social emotional learning and physical wellness for all students in BPS in order to close the achievement and opportunity gap. And our department believes that social emotional and physical well-being and positive development are critical to academic success. And when there are health inequities, these health inequities interfere with learning and disproportionately impact low-income youth of color. So as part of closing the opportunity and achievement gap, we believe we must create safe, healthy, and welcoming school environments that foster each child's cognitive, physical, social, and emotional development. There are 7 departments in the Office of Social Emotional Learning and Wellness. That's athletics, behavioral health, BPS, guidance, health and wellness, health services, safe and welcoming schools, and opportunity youth. And within the opportunity youth department, we have 3 programs. We have attendance officers, we have the Homeless Education Resource Network, and home and hospital education. And I just want to acknowledge members of my team that are here and sitting in the gallery. You've met many of them today, but I want to acknowledge them for all the hard work that they do to ensure that the social, emotional, and physical well-being of our students are met on a daily basis. If you look at the slide 2, which is our SELWA priorities there, just again, some key pieces: social, emotional learning, access to high-quality services, fostering safe, healthy, and welcoming environments, ensuring health and physical literacy for all BPS students. By that, we mean the foundational skills that permit students to use the environment to make appropriate decisions in any type of physical health or health-related situation. And finally, we continue working on improving alignment and coordination of our supports and partnerships, communications, and resources district-wide. The third slide shows our budget. And as you can see, and Jill mentioned this earlier, that really across the department, SalWell was level funded. And small changes were done to reorganization. And that's just shifting of funds between departments. And we saw some maintenance costs as a result of our budget. And as you've already heard before, some grants are ending. With that, I will turn it over to
I think we'll have to, yeah, okay. I'll take it for the next couple of slides. I just wanted to emphasize just one thing that that Amalio mentioned, and then go into some highlights of the various departments. The Office of Social Emotional Learning and Wellness, this is our second year as an office, and we are focused on the whole child. We are focused on ensuring that all children are challenged, healthy, supported, safe, and engaged. And this is really a key piece and a key strategy to making sure that we do close those opportunity and achievement gaps. The superintendent sees wellness as a key strategy. And so for that reason, as I highlight some of the key findings or the key pieces of work that have happened across the last year, know that we feel that we're working very closely with the other offices within the asset division to close that achievement gap. Number one, I want to mention for athletics, the athletics department moved to social emotional learning and wellness this year, feeling that its mission and vision were well aligned with the social emotional learning and wellness office, and we're really excited about that. Athletics supported over 6,000 middle school and high school student athletes, and you're going to hear more from Avery on that in a little bit. The next department I want to mention is the BPS CARES program, which is a grant-funded program that's focused on trauma supports, especially to 10 priority schools, which resulted this year to 916 referrals and 342 services to some of the schools that they identified were the most in need. Behavioral health services conducted 3,490 psychological assessments, provided 154 professional development offerings, and managed more than 1,000 crisis events. The Health Services Department reported that in 2015 and 16, students, the average student visited the school nurse 7 times a year. And the amazing piece is that 96% of our students remained in school after presenting to a school nurse with an illness or an injury. We've already heard about the fact that Health Services is really doing groundbreaking work by rolling out the screening brief intervention and referral treatment in high schools for 9th grade students. Just click to the next slide if we can. Thank you, Dr. Estrada. The Guidance Department hosted a citywide college fair in October with over 800 attendees, and the department contributed to a historic high in the 4-year graduation rate, which was 72.4% in the class of 2016. The Health and Wellness Department, physical education, health education, physical activity, and wellness policy and promotions programs collectively provided 69 professional development offerings in 16-17 and in-depth supports to 83 schools. That department also is currently rolling out the 2017 High School Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is underway, and critical to surveillance of a lot of different risk behaviors, which we've been doing in the district for more than 25 years. We've already mentioned that we have expanded the Safe Routes to School program as well. In the Opportunity Youth Department, which is a new department, Amalio already highlighted, that includes the homelessness initiative, home and hospital tutoring, and attendance. Over 12,000 students were served by the various services. And this year, or starting next year, we'll be launching an online attendance intervention plan to reduce chronic absenteeism. And again, you'll hear a little bit more about that. Finally, the Safe and Welcoming Schools Department, which is also a new department, which includes 3 different programs. The Succeed Boston program served 324 students with code of conduct that had code of conduct violations. The Safe and Welcoming School Specialists responded to 667 school requests for support. And the department also led the development of new social emotional learning standards and competencies for this year. So as you can see, as a group, we're really working hard collectively, and I'm going to turn it over to Amalio to just close, to say where we're headed with priorities for next year.
So just some of the priorities that my team has established in terms of policy and environment, continuing to update our policies and ensuring that we continue to develop implementation supports, and promotions that support positive changes. One of the things that our team is focused on is developing and supporting student support teams and making sure that those teams are working cohesively within their schools. System-wide, looking and developing a menu of multi-tiered systems of supports for students, realigning some of our professional development offerings, and aligning and improving communications in terms of health ed and PE instruction, improving instructional coaching, working to increase access to curriculum, assessment, and equipment. Another priority for us is social emotional learning instruction, and so increasing awareness, adoption, and integration of social emotional learning, starting in grades K to 2, and this is one of the pieces that Dr. Tran pointed out earlier, and expanding implementation of phys ed and health ed social emotional learning units, integrating social emotional learning into athletics that Avery will go into later on. And looking at our student services, ensuring again that we continue to provide high quality services to our students and their families, and aligning and improving capacity building supports in our schools. The next slide. With that, I'll turn it over to Brian Marks, who's our Director of Homeless Education Resource Network.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. What I'd like to do is provide some of the highlights and some of the latest developments happening within the Homeless Education Resource Network, or HERN. HERN has been the central arm to support homelessness in the district for over 25 years. BPS has assessed the current climate and community needs and developed a strategic plan that can maximize existing resources while building capacity at the ground level or school level. So the HERN strategic plan is a hub and spoke model in which schools will actually serve as local ecosystems to support all BPS students experiencing homelessness, all while driving streamlined access, two-way communication, greater collaboration both internally and externally, awareness of resources and services, and the agility to act quickly. In addition, we hope that this plan, or we believe that this plan, will help to improve educational outcomes across attendance, disciplinary issues, and academics. The path to this model is a convergence of initiatives. Today, I'll highlight 3. One is the HERN Suffolk University Partnership. This is a collaborative partnership with community psychology students of Suffolk University that provides academic, social, and emotional support through mentoring and tutoring. Currently, we have 13 Suffolk University students serving the program and 115 Boston Public Schools students participating. This is a mixed group of students. It's targeted towards the academic needs of students and families experiencing homelessness, but to avoid stigmatization, it is open to all students at the 3 pilot schools, which are the Community Academy of Science and Health, the Mildred Avenue School, and Mattahunt Elementary. Another initiative that's currently in the development stage is the BPS Family-Led Stability Pilot. The goal with this pilot is a multilateral partnership. It involves multiple city agencies, including Department of Neighborhood Development, Department of Housing and Community Development, the City of Boston Education Cabinet, Boston Housing Authority, of course, Boston Public Schools, nonprofit partners, housing developers, as well as the Office of Counselor Asabi George. The idea here is that the goal is to prioritize affordable housing for students and their families who are experiencing homelessness, all while providing wraparound and case management supports to address the additional services needed by that individual family. Finally, the major overarching initiative that's driving this strategic plan is a $1.2 million investment in homelessness that has been allocated directly to school budgets. The reason for doing this is to empower leaders at the school level who are our first contact point with students to be able to use the dollars to address the greatest needs of their students experiencing homelessness. BPS's role in this effort will be enhanced training and assistant, advisory and consultative support, and ensuring that there's greater access to services for students by putting the HERN referral form online and also opening up data access to school-based liaisons, or I should say school-based homeless liaisons, which have been identified for every school in the district. They will be trained as the central contact point for the communication and the rollout of this strategic plan. The goal here is that we will be able to improve our data tracking and reporting, as well as improving outcomes measurement to close the opportunity and achievement gap.
And if we can turn to the next slide, I'd like to turn this over now to Avery Esdale, Senior Director of Athletics.
Good afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for your time. I'm going to follow Brian's format that he just went through and identify a couple of priorities and a couple of highlights from our program. Obviously, as we've spoken before, currently there's over 300 opportunities for high school, middle school, and Special Olympic participants in both of those areas at schools across the district. But we're aware that there's need for additional access. As a department, we're working to identify those schools, explore appropriate and sustainable athletic opportunities for those schools for this access. And we also have to know and be aware of, we have schools that are growing and assuming different grade configurations, and we're working to accelerate the process to meet the demand of the various enrollments that we currently have in BPS. Selling Athletics, our new organizational home in BPS, directly identifies athletics as a student support, but also strategically connects us with a number of the departments that historically we have done business with to administer the program. The new connection also opens the door for athletics to innovatively think about additional ways that we can support our students in BPS. This newly created opportunity gave us the opportunity to think about SEL and its direct connection to athletics and how it could be embedded into an athletic program. I'll touch on this a little bit more in the next slide. And then in terms of student development, as a department, it's important that we support our students both on and off their arenas of competition. We've made it a priority to find ways for our students to learn more about themselves, not only through athletics, but through some of the unique opportunities that accompany participation. So we want to be in a position to take advantage to promote these accomplishments and also make it a priority so that our schools and students understand that there are other pieces that come with athletic participation. And I'll touch on that a little bit later as well. As a highlight, as a department, we want to establish welcoming athletic programs that enable as many people as possible to participate and be part of athletics for the many reasons that I personally know, and I think that many of us in the room know are important for the development of our children in BPS. The numbers identified there are through the winter. They don't include the spring, but it shows that we do have a strong following and obviously room that we'd like to grow in. And so we continue to find ways to get more people involved in the program, but also to make sure that their participation in the program is valuable and a great experience in their overall education process. I think we can advance the slide. Yeah. So I did make brief mention previously to our Remodeling Athletics for the 21st Century Committee. As I mentioned, being part of the SEL and Wellness team and department is exciting for athletics. In early 2016, we formed a committee with BPS members, community partners, and experts in the field of social emotional learning and wellness to discuss ways that we could integrate social emotional learning into athletics and have it as a tangible and visible part of our athletics program. Our committee is charged with advising BPS and specifically the athletics departments on the best ways to align our athletics program and BPS framework to our newly developed standards, as well as identify how the program can be implemented and sustained in BPS, and hopefully something that we could pass along to other districts as a resource and piece that can be used. As you can see, the committee, and I listed just a few of the names of the people that have been working with us, come from various parts of the community and have various relationships with BPS, but it really has made for a lively planning process and conversation around the possibilities of social emotional learning in athletics.
Thank
and
you.
I'm sorry, I left one piece out. I'm sorry about that in my excitement here. Just to go back to the other slide, and this is a piece that is important to me. I think as we talk about athletics and the piece and kids' ambitions and desires to go to college and have athletic experiences at that level, it's also the responsibility of the department to help to develop some of the other areas in the students. So as I had previously mentioned in part of our priorities, we have had some great highlights in the student development area. We currently have 2 students from BPS on the MIAA statewide Student Athlete Advisory Committee, and they're doing great work. Stephen Jocks from Tech Boston Academy and Will Sargent from Boston Latin School. We had 2 students attend the National Leadership Summit last summer in Indianapolis through a collaboration with the MIAA, and then we had 4 students take part in the New England Student Leadership conference at Stonehill College, where they spent 3 days working on their leadership skills, and seeing those kids interact now and their schools this year has been amazing. They've grown by leaps and bounds. And then from a department standpoint, we were able to bring 90 students down to Gillette Stadium for the MIA Sportsmanship Summit in November. Again, just creating an opportunity for the kids to experience Gillette, interact with different students across the state, learn a little bit about themselves. So just to follow up on that, I'm sorry about that.
Right. No, not at all. And we had the opportunity here to bring in the state champion Bright High School basketball team just less than a month ago, and all of them were maintaining a 3.0 grade average. All of them had offers to go to college. And athletics obviously plays a big role in their lives and has really enriched them to the point of this great achievement. And to their, to Randolph Abraham and Hugh Coleman and all those men and women from athletics, that such great role models for these young men and women in the school system. So let me now recognize Councilor Anise Sabi George.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here, and thank you for really going into some great detail on some of the pieces that, Amalia, that your department focuses on. As I said in the initial BPS overview hearing, I'm very excited about, in particular, that $1.2 million investment for students that are experiencing homelessness, and the investment in the schools and what's happening in the schools that those children attend. I'm wondering, Brian, if you could just talk a little bit about some of the ideas and proposals that those schools have shared so far on how they'll use that additional funding.
Sure. So some of the common proposals are actually funding towards a portion of a community field coordinator or someone that would serve on the student support team. That person generally also serves in the school-based liaison or school-based homeless liaison role. So that really just builds the capacity for that central contact point to be in place at the school level. Other common initiatives are setting up a clothing closet or setting up a mini food pantry, if you will, with household and hygiene items as well. Some schools are looking at housing part of the process is the advisory and consultative support that is being provided from the central office. So schools are empowered to make decisions on how to use the funding, but we are encouraging them to think about sustainability. So we're trying to help schools that are thinking about housing initiatives to partner up with existing agencies or think about how they can partner to make the referral mechanisms more effective, as opposed to, for instance, maybe running out of potential dollars, early in the school year towards housing.
That's great, and thank you for sharing that, and I look forward to sort of seeing that in action as we get ready for the next school year. And also excited, and you mentioned the BPS Family Stability Pilot, and that's the relationship with BPS and D&D and all those folks, and that work continues, I think, and the process has been incredible, and thank you for allowing us to participate in that actively. And also your strategic plan. Could you just talk a little bit about HERN's strategic plan, what you see, the achievements to date, and sort of what we're missing and what we're aiming towards going forward?
Sure. So the HERN strategic plan really took effect within the past 2 months in terms of really being in the implementation phase. The first major component of that strategic plan will actually be training of all the school-based homeless liaisons across the district. The first training session will be this Thursday in the school committee chambers at BPS, with a second training that basically mirrors the content, just to allow for flexibility in people's schedule, on Monday, May 8th. We have received project plans from about 70% of the schools across the district. And considering that some of the schools maybe had 1 or 2 homeless students and received, a lesser dollar amount, we feel pretty encouraged by that figure. So as of right now, I'd say that the major successes are the project plans that are, have been submitted or documented, and then the fact that we have, high participation have registered for the training.
And then are there any particular efforts made between sort of the younger kids that are experiencing homelessness and our older student population? In particular, I'm concerned about those that are experiencing it alone. So kids that are, unaccompanied, experiencing homelessness. So particular sort of focuses on how we're treating those two populations.
Well, what I can say about how we're treating, the different age levels is just the fact that the way we're repositioning the ability for students to request services, one of the things that we've done on the development side, in terms of the actual online Aspen portal, it hasn't been made live yet, but it has been produced on the development side, is moving the HERN referral form directly into Aspen. So what that does is, it'll break down some barriers in terms of potential shame or guilt that maybe is being felt by a high school student. So any adult in BPS Public Schools that's an employee of BPS Public Schools that a student feels comfortable with and has a trusting relationship would be able to assist that student with submitting a referral, which would go directly through Aspen to the central office. From there, we'd coordinate with the school-based liaison. So I think recognizing that, some of the shame and guilt maybe is even, more evident for high school age students. Part of that is being addressed by the process of making it easier for students to reach out to someone they're comfortable with, as opposed to, this is the person that you have to reach out to, and this is the only person you can reach out to.
And my last question for this round, through Aspen, could a student or a parent, because they have access to Aspen, which is the online system that we use in BPS, could a student or a parent also access that application?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. That's phase 2, but that will follow up, pretty expeditiously after phase 1. So the goal is to get all of the school-based liaisons trained so that they understand the process and they're comfortable with it. And then we feel like from there, once that's been adopted, that we can then open it up to the parents and students. But that would be, most likely in early school year 17-18.
That's fantastic. And I just, before I give up the microphone, just from the strides that we've made from last year to this year have just been incredible. I think you remember in our first hearing last year how disappointed I was that we had one line that referenced and used the word homeless twice. And to now come to a point where we have an investment of $1.2 million using those two same numbers in a very different way really is an incredible success, I think, for us. And I really want to applaud your effort because, you know, I've sort of complained about it on this end, but you've taken those complaints both, you know, in partnership with the administration and my office, and it really made incredible strides. And our focus on this vulnerable population and the work has been tremendous. So I just want to thank you for that.
We thank you for your support. I think I don't consider them complaints. I consider them constructive feedback. And I do want to acknowledge, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the efforts of Mary William, who's not here today, but she has been working very closely with Brian on these pieces. And there are several volunteers who come in all the time to work in our Hearn office, and interns who really make it work there. So,
Great, thank you.
Council Presley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank all of you for being here today and what you do every day. Certainly appreciate our partnership on everything from improving the quality of school food to laying the groundwork to getting our entire school district on pace to be trauma-informed. You know, have seen some great strides and appreciate the level of prioritization that's been given by making this cabinet level post and department. So good to be with you. I wanted to ask on the Selwell highlights slide, the behavioral health services numbers that are provided, these data points, it's difficult to tell if we are, so if we look at the suicide risk threat assessment number specifically, I don't know what that number was last year. So is it possible to speak to if these numbers are level for all of these data points, if these are increases or decreases? You don't have to tell me right now, but I just would be curious to know.
Andrea's coming down. Andrea's our Senior Director of Behavioral Health.
Okay.
She may have it because I know she collects great data.
Okay. Good to see you. So just trying to get a sense generally on the behavioral health services slide, the data points on page 4, say 3,490 psychological assessments, 5,304 IEP counseling sessions, 211 suicide risk threat assessments, et cetera, et cetera. So can you give me a sense if these numbers are consistent?
Sure. So Amalo is correct. We love data in behavioral health. So I can get you that data and compare it to last year.
Okay.
Some of the bullets have decreased while others have increased. So when we look at the number of psychological assessments, we've been working very extensively with a number of schools to adopt multi-tiered systems of support. And that's allowed us to address the needs of students before we have to refer them for psychological evaluation. So we're seeing great improvements in reducing unnecessary psychological evaluations. At the same time, we are seeing a great deal of increase in the amount of mental health support students need.
Okay.
So threat assessments, suicide assessments, crisis responses, things that we've talked a great deal about.
Very good. And so that's what I wanted to know, is if, because I feel that, and I didn't know if that was just my anecdotal experience, but if we could support that with data, that we do see a surge in these sorts of needs. So, you know, when I first joined the council, there were sort of two tracks that we were looking to address, or two models, school-based health centers, and then we were pushing for an onboarding of more health resource centers. You know, it had been my experience in visiting the schools that the two top reasons students are crossing those thresholds were with mental health challenges or sexual health questions. Mm-hmm. So if we are seeing an increase on the mental health side, what are we doing to support that? Mm-hmm. So could you tell me, I just want to make sure the numbers jive. I asked this question yesterday, but sometimes we get conflicting information hearing to hearing. So how many full-time employees do we have that are dedicated to socio-emotional wellness supports, as you defined it?
So I can speak directly to my department. The Behavioral Health Services Department has 54 city-funded school psychologist positions, 1 position that's funded by Children's Hospital. We have 6 social workers who are called pupil adjustment counselors.
Okay, there we go.
So that's my Department of Behavioral Health Services. Now, we honor that there are other positions that are school-based that do not report to me centrally.
Okay.
And the figures that we shared yesterday were district-wide, so they would have fallen across other areas of our organization.
Okay. All right. And then, I don't know if I should wait for Jill, but it was mentioned that we've seen a decrease in the behavioral health budget. I'm just trying to get a sense of what percentage of their funding is grant reliant, since you were referencing the federal grant and that being compromised. So what percentage of your overall budget is grant reliant?
So a very small portion, all of my staff, with the exception of 1, are funded by the district, with the exception of the 1 position from Children's Hospital. The grant funds that we've received in my department support the implementation of the comprehensive behavioral health model. So we have a behavioral health initiative that's currently in 50 BPS schools supporting a continuum of behavioral health services. And those funds are grant funded, but my department staff are BPS funded.
Okay, and are these multi-grants or a multi-year grant that is being
A
granted?
combination of both. Historically, we've had small 1-year grants, but our biggest funding source has been generous donations from Children's Hospital that supported the development and implementation of the comprehensive behavioral health model.
Okay, great. And then again, getting back to the social-emotional wellness supports, could you speak to what is the official sort of standard recommendation of a psychologist or social worker per pupil?
So
What are the ideal ratios?
The National Association of School Psychologists recommends 1 school psychologist for every 500 to 700 students.
Okay. And social workers, any data on that?
I can get you that
Okay.
data.
And then back to my school nurse question, this consistent banging of the drum. It's my understanding we are going to be increasing the number of school nurses by an additional 2. I still don't have a sense, and I know I asked this yesterday,
Yep.
so you'll get that to us.
We have that available now.
Okay, great. So you will tell me what schools do not have a nurse.
Oh, sorry, I have the numbers available. I can get the list of schools
Okay,
as well.
that's what I'd be interested in, because
Yep.
I want a nurse in every school, and I don't have a sense right now, since we have nurses that are being shared, you know, how we're doing, and what are the statistics in terms of the recommended ratio for school nurse to student?
I defer to Maureen for that, to Maureen Stark for that.
Maureen? Okay. All right. Maureen, thank you for joining us. I just was looking for the recommended nurse to student ratio.
A good nurse to student ratio, we have about 550 to 1. The recommended is 750 to 1. The issue is we allocate based not only on numbers, but on acuity. So right now, we have about 52 schools that share a nurse. So there are 52 small schools that have 0.5 or less. So every other school has at least 1. So the 77 other schools have 1 to 2, and with the acuity, some even have 2.5 at this point.
Okay. And do school nurses also require staff support in terms of data collection and entry and the reporting that they're required to do?
We have only 6 health paras that we deploy around the district. So yes, we do try to give some clerical support. Is it adequate? They would say no, but we try, but we only have 6.
Okay. For the district. Okay. Could you tell me specifically what's happening with the nurse at English High?
1 position was cut because their numbers are decreased quite dramatically. And so we had to use that position to fix other schools that needed more help. So it was redeployed.
Okay, so when you say that the allocation of nurses is contingent upon acuity, is population a part of that acuity?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. And then I did want to, Jill, dig in on where we are in terms of our approach. I believe the school-based ones, were those being phased out? I think we had 8 and then maybe 6 health resource centers. So I want to get a sense of how many school-based health centers, how many health resource centers that should be also providing access to condoms, and what is our vision where these models are concerned.
Okay. So we currently have a total of 16 school-based health centers. 8 of those are run by Boston Public Health Commission, and another 8 are run by a variety of other community partners. And in terms of health resource centers, which you'll remember for others that may not know, health resource centers don't have a medical staff. They have educators who provide in-class education around sexual health, and they also do one-on-one counseling, and they do provide access to condoms. So we have 8 that are doing sexual health instruction. We actually have a total of 9, but in one of those schools, they're not actually in the classroom. They're just providing the one-on-one.
And what are their hours, Jill?
They're usually half time at the various schools. They do try to have a male and a female educator on site together, so that they feel that's a more effective way to reach the students. I did want to say, though, that because of the wellness policy that passed in 2013, all of our nurses all of our high school nurses are able to also provide access to condoms and one-on-one counseling. So we have, in addition to the nurses, we also established condom accessibility teams. The goal there was so that if the nurse wasn't the person that you might be more comfortable talking to someone else as well. So we wanted a team of folks that would be able to be available to talk to and get access to condoms. The nurses do lead all of those teams.
Well, that is encouraging news, and again, testament to our longstanding collaboration and partnership of this space. It certainly is one of my proudest contributions to this body is the development of that policy. And thank you for adopting it. And I'm glad we're taking the steps to see it implemented. On the Health Resource Center front, given the unique role that they play, could you just speak to the vision for the district? Is the idea to stay at 16 school-based health centers and 8 to 9 health resource centers? Is the goal to morph all of them into health resource centers and to have them district-wide? What is the goal and what is the timeline?
Sure. So we are working very closely with the Boston Public Health Commission on this and to establish what the vision would be there. I think that one of the goals for us is to ensure that all students get sexual health education across the district, regardless of what strategy or who's providing it. So as you know, we've also been doing a lot of training around Boston Public Schools staff, and our wellness policy states that we would have licensed health education teachers that are trained in the middle and high schools. And so we have really done a great job of increasing the number of BPS staff that are trained to do sexual health education. Really, it really is a comprehensive approach that we're trying to take, which means utilizing BPS-trained, licensed teachers, but then also partnering with some other key partners to make sure that we're able to reach the biggest
And I
group.
know we have to be creative for resource sharing purposes, but I would like to, and this is no disrespect in any way, avoid a situation where we have the phys ed teacher teaching this. I mean, the goal ultimately, I appreciate the merits of cross-training and again, given limited resources, but is it our goal ultimately to have licensed health educators?
Yes.
And how many do we have currently?
Yes, that is our goal. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Pat Santon, our Director of Health Ed, to come down because she can give you the extreme lay of the land on all the numbers
Okay.
that you want. So Pat, if you wouldn't mind.
Awesome. And then I'll just have one final question in the trauma response space, and I'll be good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Councilor Campbell, for allowing me to go out of order.
Hello, Councilor Presley.
Good afternoon.
I'm Pat Santon, and I work for the Health and Wellness Department under Jill. So you asked about numbers of licensed health education teachers?
Yes.
Let me just grab my sheet for that. So currently, there are 33 licensed health education teachers in the district, and of these, 4 are exclusively teaching health education. So a number of those teachers are dual certified and perhaps are teaching another subject area or within another discipline.
Okay. And what would be the optimal goal if we had every resource available to us and a pool of licensed health educators waiting for an opportunity? What would be the educator to student ratio for that would allow us to equitably implement the sex ed and wellness policy?
So I know that we did do some numbers on that. I don't know if you want to.
Do you have them? You can go ahead, Pat, if you want to. I have found it here, Pat, but
Yeah,
you
thank
can
you.
correct me. We did some estimates working this summer with folks in the mayor's office around doing some estimates about what it would take to actually fully implement the wellness policy around health education. We worked with our budget office as well. And based on our estimates, the number of FTEs that we would require would be 39 FTEs.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. And again, just, offering my gratitude for our steadfast partnership and your commitment around social-emotional wellness supports, and specifically resilience and trauma recovery, if you will. We've partnered on a paper tiger screening for a very successful trauma-informed school model. And I just want to know your thoughts on where you think we are, because if we agree that healthy students are better learners and that trauma is a barrier to learning, we don't want access to those services and those supports to be arbitrary or ad hoc. We know trauma takes on many manifestations. It is not just about children who are exposed to and experiencing violence in community. It is any disruptive act. Poverty is traumatic. Displacement is traumatic. Divorce is traumatic. Bullying is traumatic. So for these disruptive events in the life, increasingly so, of our young people, how can we be building that resilience in them all the time and not just in the wake of some of the more high profile and dramatic incidents? Is it the goal of this district, and is there a plan for every school to be trauma sensitive and informed?
I'll start with some pieces, and then I'll ask Andrea to jump in as well, because Andrea does so much of the work in this area. There have been some key learnings, as Dr. Estrada pointed out earlier, in terms of the grant that we received from the Massachusetts Office of Victim Assistance and the BPS CARES piece. And one of the things is that we continue to look at ensuring that we provide opportunities for individuals to learn. And through the MOVA grant, we are rolling out a series of professional learning opportunities for our teachers and administrators and support staff, and those will be rolling out later on. Part of the sustainability piece is curating resources that we can put online. And so Marta Gredler, who leads the efforts around BPS CARES, is working with our partners to curate some resources that then will be made available to all staff district-wide. Andrea, as well as our Director of Safe and Senior Director of Safe and Welcoming Schools, Jody Algie, and Marta Gredler, have been planning this summer to prepare a professional development series around trauma-informed practices that they will be rolling out next school year. We're looking also at coordination with the Boston Public Health Commission. I know Andrea's done some work with the Boston Public Health Commission, and I will be meeting also with them to continue to, again, how do we align efforts around trauma-informed support? And then we've had a recent opportunity come at us through Sandy Hook and the Promise Initiative. And Andrea will be helping us lead that effort, working with Kim Pelletro from our safety office. And again, this is another initiative to be rolled out next year. And we're doing some trainings, also some very, I think, powerful trainings that we've rolled out this year to continue to inform our teachers of best practices out there. And another piece that I wanted to highlight is through the MOVA grant, we've been able to purchase some calming kits that we've been sending out to schools. And so on some of my visits to schools, we've seen some of those kits being used.
Okay.
And I'll have Andrea add.
Thank you. Sure. So Amalio has touched on several initiatives. I'll step back and say the way to build a school's capacity to be trauma sensitive is, again, through a framework that allows these initiatives to all come together. So staff are being trained on how to support students. So the first step is, how do we create a culture and climate that's supportive? So we've mentioned it here a few times today, but we're using the multi-tiered system of support model to leverage how do we build school-based capacity to create a more positive climate. So that involves, as Amalio mentioned, looking at our culture in our buildings and our teacher training. It also means direct social skills instruction for students. What we want to do is prevent trauma from occurring when possible, to promote healthy behaviors. And so we're using direct social skills instruction so kids have the skills they need to mitigate issues that occur, to work with their peers and develop friendships. And then we are working both in the district and with a wide array of partners to respond to issues as they come. So you've often been an advocate for what do we do after a crisis, as well as what do we do before to prevent a crisis from happening. And that's not a one-item solution. That's an array of things from different initiatives Amalio talked about, where we're providing teachers training, we're bringing in curriculum, and we're working on that, creating a safe and supportive school environment through embedding practices, teaching practices, adult behaviors, often key to creating that environment, and then pulling in partners to augment the services we have. So for example, working with Kim Pelletro and Safety Services and the Sandy Hook Promise, we'll be bringing in Mental Health 101. It's a training used around the nation, supported by SAMHSA, and it allows all adults to understand what mental health is and understand how they can support positive mental health and students with mental health issues. So that's a great example of something we've been looking for funds to do, and now we have this partnership that's going to allow us to train. We're not doing that in isolation. We're working very closely with the Public Health Commission and other community providers to say, how do we as a city think about mental health? Just like in the past, we've talked about how do we as a city respond to trauma. And Amalio referred to Public Health Commission. We work with them in a lot of ways, one of which is their new crisis response teams. So for years, we've highlighted the issue that we can go in and respond in the moment. Lots of different people were, and the families weren't getting follow-up to help support them through trauma. So we're very excited with the JRI teams and the SMART teams, because now when Kim or I or Rick or others are aware of a trauma, we get out and we do the work that we've always done in BPS, and then we have these warm handoffs. So already before the initiative was even officially launched, there's been multiple times that the JRI team and I have worked together to get services out to families, to some of our own staff, to community members. So it's been a wonderful addition and extension of the work we've been trying to do.
Wonderful. Well, I'm pleased to hear about the strengthened alignment and improved coordination in this space. And I'll just, close by saying, it was really my having the opportunity to observe up close and personal your team at work that just reinforced for me how important it is that we are building this capacity all the time, because the school community responds to, and the young people especially, to those with whom they already have a trusted relationship with. And often, activists and elected officials, although very well-meaning, are sort of parachuting in the middle of these incidents, wanting to show care and concern, but it is more disruptive. So we need to be building that capacity within these school communities and that culture and that climate all the time, because those are the adults that they most interface with and trust. So thank you all. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Councilor Campbell.
Thank you, Councilor Siumo. And thank you guys for the presentation. And thank my colleagues for the questions they've already asked, many of which were the same as mine. So I'll just address those that were not asked. Just quickly, going back to Brian in the Hearn network. Thank you. It was exciting to hear, and first of all, thank you to Councilor Sabi George for her work in this space, and particularly that $1.2 million investment. But it was exciting to hear about the sort of phase one, doing the training of school-based providers and those who would do referrals for families and students, but also to hear about phase two is coming for direct access by families and students. Is that going to be available in different languages for families that obviously don't speak English as a first language?
Yes, absolutely. We'll be working with the Office of Instructional and Information Technology to make sure that that tool, that form, and sort of that component of Aspen mirrors the multi-language offering that we have across Aspen.
Wonderful. And how many schools currently, so I know you talked about what the schools are going to be using these resources for. What schools actually are receiving the $1.2 million? Like, do we have a breakdown of how many schools and which schools are receiving how much money?
Yeah, essentially every single school in the district. I have a breakdown of the dollar amounts allocated per school. It's based on a weighted formula, and there's two weights, and it's per pupil allocation. So one is the total number of students experiencing homelessness in the school, and the second weight, again, per pupil allocation, is the concentration or the percentage of students experiencing homelessness out of the total student body. And I can provide that.
That would be great. Through the chair, I'd request that list. Thank you. And thank you for all your work, and Mary as well, and Councilor Sabi George. Thank you. And then I have just some follow-up questions on specifically the social emotional learning work, and thank you guys for the work that you guys are doing. All of you, including athletics as well. It obviously informs the whole child. I just have some sort of bigger picture questions, and it's similar to some of Councilor Presley's questions. Really? Councilor Presley's questions. And I thank her for the work she's been doing and advocating for in this particular space, even before there was this department. So one of the priorities is rolling out instruction for the K through second graders. At what point and sort of what's the timeline to obviously reach more grade levels, more students? And what do you think are some of the limitations to reaching more students? Is it resources? Is it just making sure that we do it in phases to get it right? Be curious to hear your answers to those.
Sure. Well, the piece around the K2 is very strategic because we know that we want to be sure that students can read and that they're social emotionally well by grade 3. And so we are concentrating some efforts there and really placing a bet, if you will, saying that if we do a good job implementing this with fidelity, as Dr. Tran pointed out earlier, that we feel that there will be less referrals to special education for both academics and behavior. So that's one piece. But just because we're focused on the K-2 piece doesn't preclude us from doing work from grades 3 to 12. Actually, work has been going on in that space over the years, Andrea's been doing work through the comprehensive behavioral health model with social emotional learning and wellness, culture and climate, all those pieces that she talked about through a multi-tiered system of support. There's efforts going on there. We've got efforts at schools where people have been doing restorative practices. At some of our schools, they're using other curriculum, Open Circle, Second Step. They're also using social thinking. So there's a variety of efforts throughout the district. And so our hope is to continue to curate what are those best resources that are out there, and develop a menu of support of recommended approaches and curriculum and supports that we will provide to schools. That way, again, this team can focus and do a good job of providing supports to our schools.
So right now, and I agree with you, I know there's even some high schools that are doing incredible work in the social emotional learning space, even though they may not every high school obviously has access to the same services. Some of these providers are outside coming in and doing amazing work through partnership. But we know how important social emotional learning is. Tremendous data out there for not only how important it is for our schools, how important it is to vulnerable populations. I mean, this work is being used in prisons and youth detention centers before folks come out so that they can truly have sort of the possibility of rehabilitation, right? So I'm given the makeup and the demographics of our population, and particularly what students are dealing with every single day, whether where their school is physically located or where they're coming from, what neighborhoods they're coming from. This work is so critical as a foundation. So while I appreciate the efforts that different schools are doing, really want to sort of have a sense of timeline as to when every elementary school, when every middle school, when every high school can expect to have this informed, this as a part of an informed curriculum, as a foundation. Just like we all want to see every school have a nurse, we're not quite there yet. But I don't want to keep coming back to council hearings and council meetings and budget hearings over the next 10 years. I don't think I'll be here in 10 years. And frankly, keep asking the same question. So what will it take to sort of get there? And is it a resource issue? Is that part of the equation? Are there other factors as well?
Well, one of the things, let me first, I think that as Dr. Tran pointed out earlier, those 4 instructional strategies that he had, one of them was safe, healthy, and welcome or sustaining school environments. So one of the pieces that we're doing this summer and is that my team is working with the Opportunity and Achievement Gap Office to put together a district-wide training, a series of trainings that we will put out. So that's one piece to ensure that, again, that we are getting out to all schools and providing them pieces. The second piece is that as part of the professional development offerings that will be coming out of the Office of Social Emotional Learning, we will be creating a series also of professional learnings on social emotional learning, explicit instruction, rolling out the standards, showing how the standards can be integrated into instruction. What are the adult practices? The other piece is that through our health education curriculum, we are rolling out social emotional learning. Through PE, we tie in social emotional learning into those pieces as well. We have the Project Adventure curriculum that uses social emotional learning. Through the comprehensive behavioral health model, which is at 50 schools, and next year it's 50 or 60 now?
50 now, 60 next year.
So 60 schools next year, where again, the comprehensive behavioral health model integrates social emotional learning curriculum as a piece of that. So these efforts continue to grow. Am I going to tell you that resources are enough? I think it's like Maureen says, there can always be more resources, but I think also we've got many folks throughout the school district, partners who have been helping us with these efforts. We've got this wonderful opportunity from the Wallace Foundation to look at social emotional learning in school and out of school time, so that way we can look at how we continue to ensure that social emotional learning is happening every day, every hour, every minute. And so how long will it take? I hope sooner, but I think we're talking about, we've got a good start because we already have many good practices in place.
Over 5 years?
I would say my vision is by 3 years. That's as part of
Someone's
our
shaking their
strategic
head to
plan.
5
That's
years.
what we
Okay.
as part of our strategic implementation plan. I think the team has an ambitious goal of 3 years.
Because I think it's important to be able to share that to the public, with the public. I also think you push up timelines when you have a better sense of what the need is. So if it's resources, if it's more human capital, if it's better expertise. I mean, I don't know all this. I'm not the expert. If it's us, frankly, making it a priority and a commitment and saying, we are going to have a nurse in every single school, and so we're not going to accept a budget again until we have a nurse that is designated to every single school. So it's a whole bunch, I think it's a combination of things, but we can't know how to really advocate and what to push for if we don't hear sort of in explicit terms what the need is on your side as well. We hear it from community to a certain extent, but it's sometimes more complicated. It's not always black and white. And for some community folks, it can just seem black and white. And so this is helpful to sort of be able to bring this information back. My last question is on the ground. So I spend a lot of time sort of at my schools, spending time with school leaders in meetings, particularly with school leaders across different school types and grade levels. And one of the frustrations I often hear is when it comes to either social emotional learning support, other departments at the district level, family engagement, that when they pick up a phone and call for some support, that sometimes that support doesn't show up. So I'm curious where your department, behavioral health, others think they can do a better job in that responsiveness to schools on the ground. They're going through something traumatic. Some of these schools have to go outside, and I've heard these complaints, and it's quite sad, go outside the district to other providers for support for their students because, frankly, they had a 6-year-old who just wasn't doing well on that particular day. So I'm curious, where do we need to do better as a district and as a city?
I'll just briefly introduce it, and then I know I'd like Andrea to speak to it. We recognize that sometimes, I think it was even when it came up earlier, when we miss kids in terms of special education, IEPs. I mean, if we are informed, we act upon those pieces right away. That's a key priority for us. We want to be responsive to the needs of our students and families. And Dr. Strada has been working with a team of the Well folks as well as the special ed folks to do some key pieces around behavioral supports and responses. And so I'll turn it over to Andrea.
Sure. So there's different levels of response. There could be an individual child in crisis, a group of kids, or an entire school community. Often when that happens, it's several school communities impacted. So I'll kind of start at the student level and work my way up. So as I mentioned, my department has 55 school psychologists. On average, they're assigned to 3 schools. Every BPS school has a school psychologist assigned to them, but on any given day, that person may not be in the building, right? And so what does the building do when the school psychologist is there? They're there to offer support to that student that's having an individual crisis. If they are not there that given day, schools often use the nurse as support for students. That happens a great deal. 90 of our schools have a mental health partner. That is a community mental health partner that comes in and provides support to a smaller group of students. And so they are there. Amalia referred to an initiative that we're working on with Dr. Strada on, which is how do we have a central location for requests for support for individual students? So sometimes a leader will call me, sometimes they'll call special ed, sometimes they'll call Jody, and how do we have a system that makes it easier for the leader to connect those supports. And so we're working on a centralized process that they can do that. There are other times when it's a group or a school-wide crisis incident, and Amalia was referring to that. We always respond. When an administrator lets their leaders know, assistant superintendents know that there's a crisis in their building, then they activate our crisis response system, and we have Crisis Go as an app that leaders can request crisis support from. That notification immediately goes to our entire crisis team, which members of the cabinet are on, and members of the crisis team, and we respond immediately. Just to give you a sense, we have 3 crisis situations we're dealing with today as we're here. We have team members responding to schools. So on a daily basis, we're providing crisis response to schools in need. Sometimes that, again, is isolated to one school that has something, but very often when community violence occurs, it impacts multiple schools, and multiple teams are activated to provide that support.
Very helpful. I'll just end with this. First of all, thank you for all the work that you guys are doing. I know it's very challenging. No one's calling me for immediate response to their school situation. So my questions are always should be crouched in this idea that I'm very grateful for the work that you guys do. I will say I'm a firm believer in always thinking about how we can, of course, do better. I'll speak from the elected government side. Sometimes we do a lot of this instead of doing this, and looking at ourselves and thinking, how can we improve? How can we do better? How do we admit when we've done something wrong, when we haven't something didn't work out as we thought it would in practice? We thought it was great in theory. So I'm always thinking about how we can do better. So some of my questions obviously come from that space. And I think, frankly, families, parents, teachers, school leaders, students in particular, really appreciate that when we come from that space, because there are students right now who are not who feel as though they're not getting the support that they think they need. There are school leaders who feel like they're not getting the support that they think they need. Teachers as well. And so we need to acknowledge that, as we say, we have these long-term plans, we have some short-term plans, but we also need to acknowledge that we're not quite there yet. So I appreciate your work. Thank you for the long presentation. Thank you to Councilor Siomo. Thank you, Councilor Asabi George.
And thank you. Andre, I do want to thank you, though, for bringing up and asking Brian the question about how many schools we have children that are experiencing homelessness, because I think it's really important to note that it is in every school. We do have children in each one of our Boston Public Schools that are experiencing homelessness, so thank you for identifying that. I just want to very quickly, I think it's Maureen and Jill, on the marijuana, preparing for sort of the change in the legalization of recreational marijuana. I just really want to say, I wrote the word yay because I attended, a number of us went out to Colorado earlier this year, and I had an opportunity to meet with the Denver public school system, and just really they had some great concerns as in their own district because they weren't prepared for medical or for recreational when it came on board in Colorado. So to hear that you're thinking about it and preparing for it is gratifying to me, because I think it's something that we're not fully prepared for as a city and a state for the legalization of the recreational piece. And I also, before I switch over to some of the athletic questions, I do have, on the school psychologist, Andrea, you were saying we have about 54, 55 of them if we include the children's funded one. That's less than 1 per 1,000 students in BPS. What are we doing, and this is a question I had last year because I went and looked at my notes, what are we doing to right-size that so that we're at least meeting the standard of 1 to 5 to 700 students? And I'd like to see us at that 500 mark. What sort of steps can we take as a district to right-size that number? Or Dr. Estrada?
I would say that it is something that we continuously reflect on, of what are the expectations that we have for our school psychologists, as well as when you look at NAS's description of what are the things that school psychologists do, there is a much bigger and broader list of things that, based on NAS's description, that folks will do, especially around the prevention work. And so I think that's one of the pieces of conversation that we're having is, how do we expect the school psychologists to continue work? I think this is why we're also being very clear about broadening where those responsibilities around social emotional support exist. Jody LG has been one of our team members as well, who's leading that work. We have Jill and we also have Maureen who engage in these conversations about how do we broaden what that understanding of support is, in particular around trauma. One of the things that I'm finding is there are certain things as an educator, and I know you've been an educator yourself, that you know that there are certain social emotional skills that you come into this work, and some of us have learned them through the role. Our children are continuing to evolve. And so we're finding that there are certain skill sets that we need just the general staff and support to be able to have and understand and be able to assess in many ways some key areas that some of our students may need, some very explicit teaching around social emotional learning skills, but also knowing that we need highly talented and highly skilled staff who know how to target particular supports and services. And so I think we're trying to do an assessment of when you hear from Eleanor the number of FTEs that exist around this kind of support, there's a lot of people, but I think what we're trying to assess is what do we want certain roles to really be about, because we know we have that need in the district, whether it's assessments or things like that. And where do we need a team of people, whether it's central, within schools, where is the right place for these kinds of supports to exist to be the most meaningful and most impactful to the students that we want to support, especially this highly qualified staff.
Right. And when you talk about that meaningful and impactful psychologist in particular who is highly trained, I also want to make sure that they're doing more than just assessments, because I think we get bogged down. And if I look at my notes from last year compared to this year, we've increased, I think, by 1,000. I put my other packet away already, but by 1,000, how many psychological assessments we've done. And are our psychologists able to practice their work, not just do the assessments? And I think we really need to make sure that we're transitioning and that we're really allowing these professionals to do both of that work. That doesn't sound right, but that they're able to participate in assessments because they have to and they're mandated to by law to participate in assessments, but they're able to do sort of the clinical services piece and provide services to our kids.
We agree, and that's part of our assessment right now. Where do we have that staff and where we'd like to see them grow? Great.
And then I do want to recognize that we've been joined by Counselor Baker, and I have a few questions about athletics, and then if you've got anything. You go girl means fat girl running. I'm sorry, that's just my own editorial. So Avery, thank you very much for joining us today to talk about BPS athletics. I, was once a high school teacher in Boston. I coached softball at East Boston High. We had very successful and still have a very successful program for kids that are athletes and looking forward to participating in sports and BPS. Can you just do maybe a little bit of a rundown on how you spend your particular budget, and then maybe with a little bit of focus on how it's divided up between girls sports and boys sports?
Yeah, we're budgeted at a little bit over 3.5 million for FY18. We really look at, there's probably 4 big buckets that I look at in the budget. One of those would be just payment of the coaches' stipends that come with hosting the sports at your school. So that totals about a little over 1.9 million. The second bucket that we would look at would be our fees for outside services and officials. We spend about $380,000 a year to support all the different officials for the varsity, JV, middle school contests, EMTs, assigners, different pieces that come with that. The other bucket that we would look at would be uniforms and equipment, which comes in at about $240,000 divided up amongst the over 300 teams that we have.
What was that dollar amount again?
240,000.
Just taking notes here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. And then, the last big bucket that we deal with is facility rentals. The number in the budget's identified at about 83,000. It's probably more like 93,000 when push comes to shove, and that would be for track at the Reggie Lewis Center, hockey games at Northeastern, practice ice time with DCR rinks. Porta potties out of some of our fields. So, pieces that support the athletics programs, the specific needs of athletics programs.
And do you, for your I would imagine for equity, you need to divide that up between what we're spending on female sports and what we're spending on male sports.
Yeah, I mean so when it comes to officials and the support pieces, that would follow the games, you know. So each sport has a limitation in terms of the number of overall games that they can play, and you know, in terms of budgeting standpoint, we would look at half of that, assuming half of those games would be at home, and make sure the funds followed that. From an equipment standpoint, each team is identified a certain allotment of money, and that does not vary between boys sports and girls sports. So
boys baseball is getting as much as girls softball.
I believe I will
And then
get you the exact numbers.
how do we account for some of the larger team sports that are just for males, like football, for example? Or is it because we don't technically exclude females from playing?
Well, right, correct. Females are not excluded from playing football. I think it really comes down to what the equipment costs are, and part of what we need to look at as a department is really what are the costs, the true annual needs of a team, and start from that standpoint to at least evaluate if these allotments are correct. As I mentioned before, we have the teams on a uniform rotation, and I believe in past years that allotment was meant to cover some of those uniform needs. But since we pulled that out and we're funding that centrally as a department, it opens the door to look at what are the true needs, you know, for a volleyball team, for a softball team, you know, for a baseball team, for a football team, and start at that point as a baseline, and then try to build up, you know, the money around it.
How many athletic teams do we have in Boston Public Schools?
We have, I put this number down. It was,
I-
we
I-
have,
I guess
yeah,
between-
two. So we have, ooh, I put this in the wrong place. I'm sorry. We have, I can do a quick math. I just had this. I can. We have at the high school level. There's 86 fall sports, 84 winter teams, and then 73 spring teams, which I believe, if my quick math is right, is a little bit at around 240. At the middle school level, we sponsor 20 boys basketball teams and 20 girls basketball teams, and then we sponsor 22 middle school boys co-ed track teams. And then on top of that, we do a stipend for about 30 Special Olympic offerings over 3 seasons.
Great. And then there's been lots of questions, I think recently, that I've heard sort of on the circuit with, you know, former coaches that I worked with and teachers that I worked with about our ability as a district to sustain some of our teams, because of some schools are just showing up with very low numbers. And have we thought sort of over the long term, how are we able to either sustain, or do we have to start looking at merging schools more strategically than what we've done to date with cooperatives?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of questions that we need to answer from a district perspective that obviously we need to drive. Number one is, you know, just a question around does every school need to have every sport that we offer? And
Well,
then
every school doesn't have every.
No,
because we
but
have a
I mean,
cooperative.
right, so
But
as
what they have right now.
Right. So, you know, are there certain sports that, given what we know about enrollment, what we know about facilities, what we know about the demographic at the school, that we would make sure that we kept with that and looked at, you know, how that would play out in terms of is it right, just like you said, is it sustainable to continue what the current offerings are? I think the other piece is, right, would some type of merger amongst neighborhoods, amongst area schools, create a better experience for the kids and ensure that we have the numbers for participation and pieces that come with it. The big piece around athletics, and I think the piece where you know, the discussion would have to be around is the schools take great pride in having their name across their jersey and being able to tout the team. And so going down some of those paths, we'd have to seek out and get some commitment from, you know, school leaders and the communities around why it would make sense to consider some of these mergers.
Right. No, and I think actively engaging them in that conversation is so important.
Yeah.
Because it is, you know, as where I played and then where I coached, there is a tremendous amount of pride in wearing that particular uniform, and you want to maintain that. But I think it's probably time to do some real long-term strategic planning for athletics, and understand if there's a need in shifting some of our offerings to different sports, because some schools, I think we only have 1 or 2 lacrosse programs, for example, in the district. And, there are kids that desire to play on those teams. So are there cooperatives, and how do we really have thoughtful cooperatives? Because I think I looked it up quickly. I think there's maybe 3 dozen cooperatives, and that's the agreement of schools to let kids play on each other's teams. But some of them don't need to exist anymore because the sport has been long gone, or something to that effect. Have we ever done with BPS Athletics a sort of a capital plan? What sort of investment does athletics need in order to really perform going forward across the district?
Yeah, I think those are the kind of next steps and pieces that I would identify, having an idea of the schools that we're dealing with now. Coming into the job, I was very optimistic, and I think there's a learning curve, when it comes with anything with BPS in the city, and so that would be one of the pieces I think we'd have to look at, along with that conversation around what the configuration of athletics look like, or what the pieces are involved in creating a program that's one, I think, provides a quality experience for the kids, where it's and that's not even from a competitive standpoint, just from the ability to field an appropriate number of kids on a team, the ability to learn something about the sport, the ability to learn something about yourself, the ability to have fun and interact with your teammates and some of the other adults in your school in a way that you might not do. But really looking at what the money is that would need to come with that, and some of the pieces that would need to be in place, if you looked at different configurations of athletic teams.
Right, and giving kids, my desire is to give kids an opportunity to play the sports they would like to play, but also exposing them to sports they maybe never knew they could play.
And
that was,
yeah.
My dad wanted me to play soccer. I had zero interest in playing soccer, and then a nun in my Catholic school gave me a softball one day and fell in love with it immediately, and never was exposed to it before that. I've had a number of conversations with the district about later high school start times, and I wonder what sort of impact a later high school start time would have on BPS athletics.
Yeah, we've had some talks with other departments in areas that would be involved in this, namely operations and some of those pieces in terms of how that would look and how that would play out athletically. From my perspective, I think it's a district commitment, which would in turn somewhat make it a city commitment. And so I think we'd have to look at, are some of our start times still sustainable in terms of getting kids to a field, or giving them adequate time to warm up and prepare to play a game or have a practice. And then I think work collaboratively with the Parks and Recreation Department around how that might look, where we might need to have some common understanding amongst BPS and community organizations around use of fields, and what some of the opportunities might be to explore to make it work out for everybody involved.
I think that there's some misunderstanding about my desire for later start time, and I'm looking for an 8:30 start time, and some of the feedback I've gotten from a number of individuals with the district is, Anissa's looking for a 10 a.m. start time, which would really throw things off on the other end. And for the record, I want to clarify that I think we can make all those things work, especially with some of our more competitive programs. They're playing outside the city anyway. They're not just playing their city games. And a lot of the other outside of the district schools and sports programs do play at later times anyway, because they're at a later start time. We, as a athletic program, we don't technically own our property. That is through Parks and Rec. So we're coordinating constantly with them to make sure that we've got time on these fields.
Yeah, we have some standard pieces in place. Basically, the hours from 2 to 5:30. BPS has the priority on the fields, but we're dealing with a district that's evolved, and we do have some schools that get out on the later end, and it may be a little bit of a squeeze when it comes to practice or games to get them in and make it work. But again, that's working with parks, around solutions and trying to be, I guess, as transparent and proactive as we can around, when a late situation may arise or how to work with that person that's following up with you on the field around, ensuring that your game can happen and finish.
Great. Great. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank
I
you.
know Councilor Baker, if you've got any questions.
Yeah, just a quick one. I'm just looking for good job, Anissa. I'm just looking for an explanation on sell well. What is it? Sorry, I got hit. It was still going on 4 hours later, so I figured I might as well come in and ask my question. Sell well.
So the Office of Social Emotional Learning and Wellness is an office that comprises 7 different departments, and we are focused on the development of the whole child. When you focused on the development of the whole child, we are looking at the child socially, emotionally, and physically. We want them to be well in all those areas. And so we have behavioral health, we have athletics, because they're doing a redesign of their athletic model to integrate social emotional learning. So these are skills and competencies that all of us need to be able to think creatively, to be able to problem solve, to be able to communicate.
So this is for the teachers and how we're looking at the children holistically.
Right. Those are skills that teachers are teaching explicitly to students, and that also that they are incorporating as part of their lesson plans. And everything that we do is really social emotional. And so we have various departments in the office that are dedicated to that work: health and wellness, opportunity youth, which includes attendance, home and hospital, homeless education. Back to health and wellness, we have phys ed, health ed, physical activity, sexual health. We have health services, so our nurses are involved in this work. We have Safe and Welcoming School Center, where we have safe and welcoming school specialists that go out to work with the schools.
So this is just a way that we're looking at the entire student. This isn't like one strand of like a certain school or
No.
certain group of kids.
This is an approach to really addressing the needs of a whole child, both from an instructional side and also from a support side and a policy side.
That's district-wide.
Yes, district-wide.
Okay. I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone have anything to add? Thank you very much. I'm going to adjourn this meeting.
Thank you.